Over in my Canva project page here, I can see where the constraints of my project lie. If I would like, I could update the background color of my canvas here. I could also choose to upload my own custom images to my image library. And once it has been uploaded, it will be displayed as I mentioned in my library here. And of course, if I would like, I could then import that into my actual canvas itself. I can then choose to reposition where this image lies on my overall canvas, as well as resize it if I would like. I also have the ability to add things like shapes onto my canvas, as well as text. And if I really like, I could update the size and color of the text itself that's featured on this page. And then of course, reposition it wherever I would like. So let's say I want it next to this rectangle here. And if I really wanted, I could also just extend my rectangle out there. And then I could select both these elements, make a copy of those, and choose to paste in another version if I would like to add any additional text. And then finally, I also have the ability to not only save my project here, but also download this as a PNG image onto my local device. Which, as you'll see, once I've downloaded this image, I can choose to share this wherever I would like, just like you would in the real-world Canva product. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build a Canva clone entirely out of no code using Bubble. Unlike most of my clone build tutorials, this one is going to be completely free, so by the end of watching this full guide, you'll have your own functional version of a Canva MVP. Throughout today's tutorial, we're going to be making use of the Fabric.JS plugin built by Techblocks. This plugin allows you to add a canvas slide into your Bubble editor in which users can draw on, add shapes and images to, and even annotate with things like text. And of course, these are all essential features when creating your own Canva clone. And so throughout our full tutorial today, I'm of course going to cover how you can add those features within your Bubble editor, as well as some additional features like how you can copy and paste particular elements on a canvas, as well as how you can flip images horizontally and vertically, and then finally how you can save a project and also download it as a PNG file. Look, there's so much that I want to cover throughout our build today, so let's just open up our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. To help keep track of our entire build today, I've just created a Notion checklist here, which is just going to cover a list of all of the features that I would like to walk through throughout our tutorial. And what I love about Notion is that you have the ability to set out a list of different items, and you can easily just tick them off as you add them into your Bubble application. And so as I mentioned, it's just a great way to help keep track of where you are throughout the whole building process. And I'll be sure to include a link to this Notion doc within the description of this video. So if you'd like access, you could just click on that. But as you can see, the very first feature I want to cover throughout our build today is the ability to create a new Canva project within our database before we build out a dedicated page that will allow someone to edit the actual project like they would in Canva. But of course, before we create something new within our database, we're just going to need to build out the necessary data type and fields to allow us to create a new entry in our database. So I'm going to jump over into my Bubble editor here. And at this point, I've just created a brand new Bubble application. I haven't made any changes to it yet. But what I'd like to do is jump over into my data tab here. And of course, by default, we're going to have the user data type already created for us within our editor. And now under the user data type, you might want to add some additional fields for a user like their name, their profile photo, and so on. I'm not going to focus too much on this particular data type, more because I'd like to explain how we can build out the data type to create a new Canva project. But for the sake of our tutorial, I am just going to add in two fields. One will be the user's name, so I'll set this to be a text field, and the other will just be a profile photo for this user, and I'll be setting this to be an image field. I'm also just going to remove the privacy rule that's applied by default here, so I'm going to click on this and then select this trash icon, and then I will jump back into my data types here And I'm going to create a new data type called project. So every single time someone creates a new image that they want to design within Canva, I'm going to be calling that a project. You could call this an image if you would like. But essentially, whenever someone creates something in our database, they're going to be creating a new project. So I'm going to choose to add that data type. And then, of course, under our data type, we're going to need to add in a series of data fields in order to store the necessary information we need for each individual project that is created. And the first data field I'd like to store for our project is going to be the name of it. And similar to our user data type, this field is just going to be a standard text field. And then after this, I'd like to add a data field which is going to store a preview image for this particular project. So if you're familiar with Canva's application here, when you visit your homepage, you can see a preview of an image for each individual project that you have created. And essentially this preview image is going to allow us to display almost like a thumbnail image for each individual project. And so I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'm going to create a new field here, and I'll be calling this field preview image. And as you would suspect, this field type is going to be an image field. I will create that. And then of course, every single time a new project is created, I'd like the user to be able to customize the dimensions of it. So similar to in Canva's real world product, you can choose to create a custom height and width for each individual project. And so I'm going to add two separate fields. The first will be called height. And this field type is going to be a number because the user will be typing in a numerical value. And then finally, I'd also like to store a field called width. And again, this will be a number. And then finally, there's two last fields I would like to add. And the first is going to be a field that allows a user to save a specific background color for their Canva project. So I'm going to create a new field here. And this will be called background color. And this is just going to be a text field type because we'll be storing a color code within this. So we're going to create that. And then finally, the very last data field we'll need to add is what's called a serialization. And so today we're going to be using a plugin called Fabric.JS, which is created by Techblocks. And in order to actually save any changes you make to your Canva project, you'll just need to save what's called a serialization ID. And so this serialization data field is essentially just going to store a long string of text which just identifies where particular elements will sit within your Canva project. And so we're going to create a new field here, and we're going to call this serialization. And because this field is a long string of text, as I mentioned, this is just going to be a text field type. And just like that, that is all of the data fields we'll need to configure for our Canva clone today. So I'm going to jump back into my Notion checklist and just tick off that we've finished building out the custom database for a new project. And as you can see, the next feature I'd like to focus on is building out the home page before we actually create a way for users to design Canva projects. We of course will just need to build out a way for those users to create a new project within our database. And so I want to build out a custom homepage like I just shown you within the real world Canva product. So on the homepage, I just want to display a list of all of a user's projects, which just displays a preview image of each project. And then in the top right hand corner, you can see there is a button here, which when clicked would allow a user to create a new project. And thankfully, it's pretty straightforward to build out this page. So I'm going to jump back into my bubble editor here, and I'm going to create a new page within my application. And I'm going to be calling this Canva Home. I will create this page. And once I've created this page, the first thing I would like to do is just open up my page's element inspector. And at the time of creating this tutorial, I will need to upgrade my responsive engine here to be the new Flexbox responsive engine, which is still currently in beta. Of course, if you're watching this at a future point in time, the Flexbox responsive engine will become the default option, so you won't need to update this. But if you're watching this as I have just released this tutorial, we're going to need to take the time to just upgrade our page. So I'm going to select this option here. Bubble will update the responsive engine of my page. And then from here, once my responsive engine has been updated, I'm just going to open up my element inspector once again. I'm just going to update the background color just to be a light shade of gray for the time being. And the reason I do this is just so that way I can see where my actual page sits on my overall bubble canvas here. And now when it comes to designing this page itself, before we add any elements onto this page, we're going to need to first head to our layout tab, and we'll need to select which particular container layout we would like for this project. And in most cases, I will select that the container layout should be a column, which just means we would like to stack items on our page from top to bottom, which in my opinion is just how you create and view most applications anyway. And when it comes to the width of the UI builder, we're going to be leaving this at 960. But as I create the page, I'll be explaining how we can update the responsive settings of all of our elements. So that way this page will be responsive regardless of the user's device size. But once I'm happy with the actual layout of the page and the size of the page, we can start adding in the first elements onto it. And the first thing I'd like to actually add is just going to be this menu in the top right hand corner of our page. So I'd just like to display a button as well as a profile photo here, which of course when this button is clicked, it's going to create a workflow that will allow us to create a new design within our application. And because these elements are positioned horizontally across our page, we'll need to add a group on our page, and we'll be setting the container layout of that group to be a row. So because our container layout of our page is set to be a column, any element that is added onto our page will be stacked vertically, not horizontally. And of course, we can leverage group elements to update the alignments of different sections of our page. And so I'm going to scroll on down here to our containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element onto our page. I'll be updating the name of this group to be called group header menu. And before I update the container layout, what I'm going to do is just jump over to my appearance tab here. I'm going to remove the style of this, and I'm just going to update the background to be a flat color. And just for the time being, I'm going to make this color a light shade of red. And now the reason I do this is so I can clearly see where this group sits on my page. When it comes to creating experiences with the new Bubble responsive engine, I like to stack groups on the page and color code them. So that way it almost feels like I'm just connecting Lego blocks on my page, which just visually helps me keep track of where everything is. Now when it comes to this group element, I'm going to want this to stretch across the full width of my page. So I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here. And first of all, I'm going to update the container layout of our group to be a row, because I want any elements within this to be stacked horizontally, so side by side. And then when it comes to actually expanding this group across the full width of my page, I'm going to head down to the width settings here. And at this point in time, I can see that this element is a fixed width of 400 pixels, which just means that regardless of the user's browser size, it's always going to be 400 pixels in width. And of course we don't want that. So I'm going to unselect this option here to make this a fixed width. I will leave the maximum width to be infinite, which just means that regardless of the user's browser size, this group here will expand to fit within the available space. And then I'm going to set the minimum width here to be 0, which just means that regardless of how small the user's device size is, this group will now contract. And now if I was to jump over into my responsive tab here and just change the width of the page, what you'll see is that regardless of the actual page dimensions, this group is going to be a fully responsive. And to be honest, the same applies for any other elements you add within your responsive engine. If you'd like them to respond to the user's browser size, in most cases, what you'll need to do is just set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. And that way, regardless of the user's device, that element will be completely responsive. But of course, as we add elements onto the page, I'm going to be explaining how I update each of their responsive settings. For the height of this group, I'm just going to leave this as it is for now, but I will come back and change that in a moment. The reason is because I just like to add in my elements within this group first. And so the first element I would like to add on our right-hand side is just going to be a user's profile photo. And so in order to add that, I'm going to head to our visual elements here. I will add in an image element. I will select to add this within our red group. And for this image, I would just like to insert dynamic data and display the current user. So that is the person who is logged in viewing their Canva application. I'd like to display their profile photo. And a personal preference of mine is that I also like to process any image with the index, because I will always tick this option here to resize to fit the dimensions by cropping it, which just means that it's automatically going to resize the dimensions of this image to fit nicely within this image here. I will then close this, and I'd just like to update the styling of this particular image. And so if I scroll on down here, I'm going to set the roundness of this image to be 100, so that way it'll become a circle. And when I'm working on images, I also like to set a solid border around them, just so that way I can see where they actually lie on my page. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can remove this border off. But what I'd like to do from here is also update the size of this image. So I'm going to jump over to our layout tab here. And then when it comes to the width of this image, I'm just going to update this to be 60 pixels. And I am going to keep this a fixed width because I'll always want this image to be 60 pixels. I won't want it to scale up or down based on the size of our page. And I'm also going to select this option here to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I keep it as a 1:1 option, it's just going to make our image 60 pixels in width and 60 pixels in height. I'm also going to update the vertical alignment of this image because I'd like to center this within our red group here. And then I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around each of the borders of our image here. So I'll add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And the reason I'm doing that is because when I close off the height of this red group here, I don't want it to touch the actual borders of my image. I want there to be a little bit of space around it. And so margins will allow me to add that in. I'm also then going to select on our red group that this image sits within, and I'll be updating the container alignment of the elements that sit within this group. So because our container layout is set to be a row, which just means we're stacking elements from side to side, we have the ability to choose where these particular elements are going to be positioned horizontally. And in this case, I'd like to align all of the elements to the right-hand side of our group, which as you can see now here, it has moved my profile photo to the right-hand side, which is exactly where I want it to be. From here, I'm then just going to add in our button, which when clicked will allow us to create a new design. So I'm going to choose to add in a button element into our red group here. And this will display the words create a design. And when it comes to the styling of this button, I just like to update the color of this to be a purple, which is the same color that Canva uses. So I'm going to head to our style here and just choose to remove this style. And I'd like to set the background color to be a purple that I have here. If you'd like that color code, it's A020F0. And then when it comes to this button itself, I'm just going to want this to be positioned on the left-hand side of our image. So if I head to our layout tab here, you'll see this option to make this the previous element within our group. And that's just going to move it over to the left. I'd also like to vertically align this in the center of my group. And then I'm just going to need to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. So that way it's in line with our image as well. And now I won't need to add any margin to the right hand side because we've added our margin on the image there. And then from here, I'm going to select into our red group here because I'd like to reduce the height of this now. So for our height here, I'm going to set this to be 0. And because we've selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse and fit nicely around all of the elements we've added into this particular group. And then from here, what I'd like to do is build out an experience that allows someone to create a new design every single time this button is clicked. And the way I'll be doing that is by leveraging a pop-up element on our page. So essentially, whenever someone clicks this button, I'd like to display a pop-up, which is going to prompt a user to give a name to a new project they'd like to create, as well as the opportunity to identify the custom dimensions for that project. And so I'm going to scroll on down to our containers menu here, and I'm going to choose to add a pop-up onto our page. And I'll be calling this pop-up create project. And on our pop-up here, I'd like to set the container alignment to be a column because I'll be stacking any elements on this from top to bottom. And the first element I would like to add onto our pop-up is just going to be a text element. And this text element will just display the word project name. I'd like to bold the formatting of this text. So I'm going to open up our rich text editor here. I will highlight this text and choose to bold that. I'll then save that option. And then I'll just need to update the responsive settings of this text element. So I'm going to jump to our layout tab here. I will unselect that this element should be fixed width. Like before, I'm going to leave my maximum width to be infinite and set the minimum width to be 0. And then when it comes to the height of this element, because we've selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, I can set the minimum height to be 0, and it's now going to collapse its height around the content, which is of course the text inside of it. I'm then also just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels of margin on the left, and 20 on the right. And as you'll see, that will just align our text element further down in our group. And then below this, I'd like to add in an input field, which will allow a user to add a name for this project they're creating. So I'm going to scroll on down to our input forms option here. I will select to add in an input field. And for this input field, I'm going to be calling this input project name. And then I'll just need to jump over to our layout tab because of course I'd like to update the responsive settings of this field. I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width at infinite. And now when it comes to the height of this input field, I'm going to leave this as the default option, which is 45 pixels in height. Just because I won't want the height of this element to change, I'm happy with the current dimensions. The only thing I will do is just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. So that way it's in line with our text element above it there. And then finally, I'd like to add in 2 additional input fields, which will just allow a user to add in the custom dimensions of this project they're about to create. And when it comes to the input fields that will store the height and width of this project, I'd like to actually stack these side by side. And of course, because our container layout for our pop-up is set as a column, I'm going to need to add yet another group within this in order to set the layout of that group to be a row. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu and I'm going to add in a group element onto my pop-up here. And then when it comes to the style of this group, I'm just going to want to remove the style here, set the background to be a flat color, and I'm just going to update this to be a light shade of red. So once again, I can see where it actually sits on my pop-up. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the container layout to be a row because I'll be stacking 2 elements in this side by side. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll be setting the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width at infinite. And when it comes to the margins of this particular group, I'll be adding in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that will just ensure that it doesn't touch any of the borders of my pop-up. Of course, once we've added our input fields into this group, we'll come back and update the minimum height. So what I'd like to do from here is add in 2 input fields. So I'm going to select to add one in here, and I'll be updating the name of this to be called input field height. And then I would like to update its responsive settings. So I'm going to head to our layout tab here. I will unselect that this should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. And I'm happy to leave the height at 45 pixels again. The only thing I'd like to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin on the right. What I'm then going to do is just choose to make a copy of this input field. And instead of calling this input field height, I'm going to be calling this input width. And because we've copied this element across from our existing input field, all of its responsive settings have been copied across as well. The only change I'd like to make is that I'd like to remove the right margin. So I'm going to set that as 0 and then just add in 10 pixels of left margin. So that way now between both of these input fields, there's 20 pixels of margin. And if I'd like, I could even update the placeholder text within each of these input fields. So under our appearance tab, I'd like this placeholder text to display the word height, just so that way the user knows that that is the field they'll be adding in their height. And then for our second input field, I'll update its placeholder text to display the word width. And then once I've added in both of my input fields into this group, I can click on the red group, head to my layout tab, and now set the minimum height to be 0. And because we've selected this option here to fit the height of the element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements there. And then finally, the very last thing I'll need to add onto this pop-up is just a button element. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements here, and I'm going to add a button onto my pop-up. And I will have this button display the word create. And I would also like to update its style. I'm going to remove the style of this because I would like to update the color of this button to be the same purple color code that I had used before. Again, if you'd like that, it's A020F0. And then when it comes to the layout of this button, I'm just going to jump to our layout tab here and horizontally align this in the center of my group. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom of this button, just because I'd like to now click on my overall pop-up and just set its minimum height to be 0. And because it has the option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of our elements there. And then from here, what I'd like to do is create a workflow every single time this button is clicked, in which case I'd like to create a new project within our database. So I'm going to head to our Appearance tab here and choose to start a workflow every single time that button is clicked. And within this workflow, we're going to be heading to our Data tab here because we'd like to create a new thing within our database. The type of thing we'll be creating is a new project. And then we'll just need to match all of the data fields in our database with the necessary fields on our page. So for this project, I'd like to first update the name of it. And this will be the value of the input project name on our pop-up. Then we'll need to update the height of the project. And this will be the value of the input height field. And then finally, there'll be the width of the project, which will be the value of the input width field. And then lastly, within this particular workflow, I'd just like to add an additional step that now redirects the user through to a dedicated page where they can start editing the actual project itself. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to select from a navigation event, and I'll be choosing the Go to Page action. The destination page at this point does not yet exist, so I'm going to need to create this. So I'm going to select from my page drop-down menu here. I'm going to choose to create a new page. And I'll be calling this page Canva Project. I will then choose to create this. And now over on this page, the only change I'll need to make in the time being is just update the type of content that is stored on this page. So because I'd like to send through the value of the new project that we've just created, I'm going to need to update the type of content to also be a project. And that way Bubble will know that it needs to display the data of a particular project across this page. I'm then going to jump back into our Canva homepage. I'm going to open up our workflow editor and choose to open the workflow we were just creating. And in the last step of our workflow, I'm going to update the destination page to be our Canva project page. And then for the data I'd like to send through to this page, I want it to be the result of step 1 in our workflow, which is the new project that we've just created. And that's how we can choose to create a new project within our application. There is just a few other things I'd like to change on our homepage. And the first is that I need to build out a workflow to actually display this pop-up every single time this button here is clicked. So I'm going to select our button here and choose to start a workflow. And this workflow is nice and easy to create. I'm just going to add in one step. I'm going to head to our element actions and just identify that every single time this button is clicked, I'd like to show an element, and that element will be our pop-up create project. It's as simple as that. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to add onto our homepage is just a list of all of the project thumbnails that this particular user has created. And so in order to display a list of projects like you see in the real world Canva product here, what we'll need to do in Bubble is add a repeating group element onto our page. And if you're not familiar, repeating groups are just a way to display a list of things stored within your database. And in this case, I want to display a list of all of the projects that have been created by the current user. And I'll just be displaying a thumbnail image of that project. And so as you can see, once I've added a repeating group onto my page here, it just displays a list of cells. Before we can choose to display our thumbnail image on this, we're just going to need to update the type of content that we'd like to display. So this repeating group is going to be pulling data from our database. And the data I would like to pull is going to be all of the projects in our database. And then from here, I'm just going to need to identify which particular projects to display. So for our data source, I'm going to perform a search in our database for all of the projects where the created by field, so that is the person who has created this project, equals the current user. So that way I'm only going to be displaying the projects that were created by the person who is logged in within their own account. I'm then going to close our data source here. And now we're going to update the layout settings of our repeating group. The first thing I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows, and also unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. And what you'll now see is that our repeating group is essentially going to fit in as many rows and columns as it possibly can within the space it's given on our page. And so of course what I'd like to do is give it more space to consume on our page because we've got all of this empty space here. So in order to make this stretch across the full width of our page, we'll of course need to jump into our layout tab here. And then we're going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. We're going to leave the maximum width as infinite, and we'll set the minimum width as 0, and that way it's going to be fully responsive across our page. For the time being, I'm going to leave the minimum height at 350, although I will be coming back to change that once I add elements into our repeating group cells. The only thing I'm also going to change in our layout tab is just the container layout. So within our repeating group cells, I want to stack all of our elements from top to bottom. So I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. And then finally, in order to give me more space to work within my repeating group, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab here. And I'm going to set the minimum height of our repeating group rows to be 300. And I'll also set the minimum width to be 300. And as you'll see, it's going to give me more space to work within for the time being. But once I've finished adding in all of my elements into my repeating group, I might actually come back and update these settings so that way it fits nicely around the content within it. But as I mentioned, within our repeating group here, I'm just going to want to display a thumbnail image of this particular Canva project, as well as the name of that project itself. And so in order to add in a thumbnail image, I'm going to head to my visual elements, and I'll be adding an image element into my repeating group here. For this image, I'm going to need to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current cells project. And by the current cells project, it just refers to the project that's going to be displayed within each cell. So if cell number 1 displays the very first project created in our database, that's going to be that particular cell's project. Cell number 2 will display project number 2, and so on. And so in this case, I'd like to display the current cell's project, its preview image, which of course is going to be an image that stores a preview of the project itself. And now while we're working on this image, I'm just going to update the border style to be a solid color, so that way I can see where the image actually sits. I might also update the roundness of the borders to be 10, so that way there's a little bit of curvature around the borders. And then finally, I'm going to jump to our layout tab here, because I'd like to update the positioning and layout of this particular image. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to align this element in the center of our repeating group there. I'm also going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. But what I'd like to do is just update the minimum height here to be 200 pixels, just so that way at minimum our image preview here looks roughly like a rectangle. The only other thing I would like to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin on the left, and 10 on the right, just so that way our image isn't touching the borders of our repeating group cell. And then finally within our repeating group, I'd just like to add in the name of the project. So I'm going to add a text element into our repeating group. And for this text element, I'd like to insert dynamic data and display the current cells project, its name. And I'd like to open up my rich text editor here because I'll be highlighting this text and bolding the formatting of that. And finally, the last thing I'll need to do is just update the responsive settings of this text element. So I'm going to jump to our layout tab once again. I'd like to unselect that this element should be fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width to be 0. I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. Because I want to collapse this element's height to fit the content within it, I'm going to leave this option ticked, and I'll be setting the minimum height to be 0. And then from here, the last thing I'll need to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And now you'll see that that will fit quite nicely within our repeating group cell. And now because we've finished adding in all of the elements into our repeating group cell, I'd like to collapse all of this empty space here at the bottom of our repeating group. And so I'm going to click on the repeating group itself, and I'm going to head to the layout tab. And under our minimum height here, because we've also selected the option to fit its height to the content within it, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. But the other thing you'll need to remember is that over in my appearance tab, I've set the minimum height of each row to be 300 pixels. What I'd like to do is set that to be 0. And now what you'll see is that it will collapse to fit around the content within it. And now, although you can only see 3 particular cells within our repeating group here, this is going to expand vertically across our page based on how many projects it needs to display. So if it only needs to display 2 or 3, it's going to display 1 row. If it needs to display 9, it's going to automatically display 3 rows. And the other thing I should point out is that over in our responsive tab here, what you'll see is that our repeating groups will expand continually based on the size of the page. So if our page can fit 4 repeating group cells, it's going to fit 4. If it can only fit 1 or 2, it's only going to fit those in. But what you'll just see is that it will be completely responsive across our application. But from here, there is one very last thing I'd like to do on the home page, and that is just create a redirect every single time the image of a project is clicked on. So whenever someone clicks on the image of their Canva project, I'm going to want to send them through to our dedicated project page that we've just created. So I'm going to select on the image here, and I'll choose to start a workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this workflow, it's nice and simple. I'm going to select from our navigation event. I'll select the go to page option, and I'll set the destination page to be our Canva project. And for the data that I'll be sending through, I'd like to send the current cells project that the user is selecting on within our repeating group. And that is everything I'd like to create on our home page. I know it took a little bit of time to build out all of the elements and design on this page, but this was definitely essential before we move on to the main feature within our application, which is allowing a user to customize a project on our dedicated project page. And later on, I'll be showing you a full preview of how this page functions. But before we do that, I'd like to build out the rest of my project page first. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist and just check off that we've finished building out all of the features to create a new project within our application. And then from here, what I'd like to do is start building out the actual project page itself, where we'll be able to create a Canva project. And using a plugin called Fabric.JS, we'll be able to edit a canvas with things like custom text, illustration, shapes, and even images. But before we do that, we'll just need to structure the page itself, which requires just a little bit of work. And so I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor here, and I've opened up my Canva project page, which at this point in time, the only change that I've made to this page is, of course, I've updated the type of content to be a project, which we had just previously done. I've also just jumped ahead and I've updated this page to be the new Flexbox responsive engine. So if you haven't done that, you'll just need to pause the tutorial and make sure that you have updated the responsive settings of your page. Like always, the first thing we're going to do is update the background color of this page just to be a light shade of gray. So that way I can see where its dimensions sit within my overall bubble editor. And then for this page itself, I'm going to update the layout for this page to be a column, similar to before, because technically I'll be stacking items from top to bottom. And of course, if I ever need to display items horizontally, I can use a combination of group elements to do that. The only other change I'm going to make here though is that I'm going to update the width of our UI builder to be 1200 pixels. So that means that just by default, this page is going to be built for a desktop device. There will be times throughout this where, of course, I'll be explaining how we can update the responsive settings. But because there's quite a few elements we'll need to add onto this page, it's best to have a larger UI builder with. And now when it comes to this page, I just want to create a similar experience to what you see within a Canva project. So on the far left-hand side, you have the option to jump between the different element types. And then next to this, you have your media library where you can upload and add in any images you'd like. And then finally, you have your actual canvas itself where you can edit any of the designs within your project. And so what I'm going to do is jump back into my bubble editor here. And the first thing I'm going to add onto my page is a group which will house the area where we can actually edit the canvas itself for our project. And so I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here, and I'm going to choose to add in a group element onto my page. And for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab. I'll be removing the style of this group, and I'll be updating the background color to once again be a light shade of red, so that way I can see where this group actually sits on my page. And so because I'd like this group to be positioned further to the right hand side of my page, I'm going to need to update the responsive settings of this group. So I'm going to head to my layout tab here. When it comes to the layout of this group itself, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. And then I'm going to unselect that the width of this element should be fixed width. And I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. But what I would like to do here is update the margin on the left-hand side of this group. So because I'd like this pushed over to the right-hand side, I'm going to add a left margin of 400 pixels. And what you'll now see is that that's going to leave me a bit of space to add in all of the additional groups or elements I'd like to include on this page. And within this group itself here, what I'd like to do is add in the actual canvas itself, where a user can actually edit the design project. And in order to add that in, I'm going to first need to install a plugin, which is the Fabric.JS plugin that I previously mentioned. And so I'm going to jump over to my plugins menu here. And at this point in my tutorial, I have already installed this plugin, but you'll just need to type in Fabric.JS, and it is the plugin built by Techblocks. And what I love about this plugin is that if you were to view the plugin page itself, what you'll see is that it comes with a whole suite of links to demo editors or documentation, which I'll be referring to throughout our tutorial today. And as you can see, this is a paid plugin. So you can pay a one-time fee for lifetime access, or you can just pay $9 a month for it. And at this point in our tutorial, I have already installed this plugin. So I'm going to jump back over to my design tab. And what I'll now see underneath my visual elements is the ability to add in what's called a canvas main element. And so when you create a design project using the Fabric.JS plugin, it refers to any of the elements within it to be called canvas. And so that obviously sounds a little bit like Canva, so I just want to differentiate between the two. So when I refer to the canvas, I'm referring to this element we're adding onto our page, which allows us to draw or add shapes into this particular field here. And now once we've added the canvas onto our page, just for the time being, what I'd like to do is just update the dimensions of this. And so after I've added this element onto my page, what I'd like to do is just update the dimensions of it. And so I'm going to head to my layout tab here, and I'm just going to update the width here to be 800 pixels, and I'll keep the height at 400. And now at the time of creating this particular tutorial, because the Flexbox responsive engine is currently in beta, when it comes to elements you've added onto your page through a plugin, you unfortunately don't have all of the same customization settings as any other bubble elements. And so right now I'm just going to set this to be a fixed width. But of course there will be a point in the near future where you'll be able to update the minimum and maximum width of this element, in which case you'll just need to set the minimum width to be 0 and of course the maximum width to be infinite, and that way it will be fully responsive across your page. What I'd also like to do while I'm here though is of course create a way for the dimensions of this canvas to update based on the dimensions that a user adds when they create a project. So if you remember on our home page, when a user created a project, they could choose to add in some custom height or width dimensions to this project. And it's at this point that I just want to explain how we can load that onto our canvas here. So this is our working area. And the way we can do that is by creating a workflow that runs as soon as this page is loaded. And then in that case, we'll be updating the dimensions of the actual working canvas here. So I'm going to jump to my workflow editor here, and I'm going to create a workflow that will run every single time our page is loaded. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word dimensions, and you'll see the option to set the canvas dimensions of the canvas on our page. And by default, it's automatically going to link this to the one canvas we have on our page. And when it comes to the width and height, we of course have these values stored within our database for this project. So I'm going to want to insert dynamic data and replace these with the current page, its width. And then I'll need to do the same thing for the height. So I'll set the height to be the current page project, its height that we had previously saved. And that's all we'll need to do for this. Back in my design tab, I'm quite happy with just leaving this canvas on our page at the moment. But what I'd like to do is add in some of the other additional menus we'll be including on our page. So on the far left hand side, I want to add our different element options, and then I'm going to add in a media library. And one thing I'll just point out is that if you remember, we had added in 400 pixels of margin from our red group and the left hand side of our page. And it's at this point that I'd like to add in yet another group on our page. But instead of adding just a regular group, what I'd like to do is add in a floating group. And now the difference, if you aren't aware, is that floating groups actually hover over any elements on your page. And so you might be wondering how both of these groups are now positioned side by side, considering that if I click on my overall page, the layout is set to be a column, which means they should theoretically be stacked from top to bottom, not side to side. What you need to remember is that when you're working with a floating group, it's technically not on our page, it's over the top of it. So although it looks like it's placed beside our group here, it's currently hovering over our page. So it just creates an illusion that it is a part of the whole page. What I'd like to do with this floating group is just update the color of this. So I'm just going to remove the style and set the background color to be a flat color. And I'll have this just be a light shade of blue, just so that way I can see where it sits on my page. When it comes to the layout of this floating group, I'm going to actually set this to be a row, because within this floating group, I'm going to add two additional groups. There will first be our group which displays our element options, and then next to that will be our media library. So if I jump back into my bubble editor here, I'm going to want to add those groups in. So I'll start by selecting from my containers menu, and I'll add my first group in. And just to clearly see where this group sits on my page, I'm going to head to my Appearance tab once again. I will remove the style of this, and I'll update the background color to be a flat color. And I will set this color to be a light shade of green. And then I'm going to jump over to my Layout tab here. And because I'd like to display a list of buttons vertically within this group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. But what I'll also do is just update the width of this group to be 80 pixels in width. And I will be keeping this as a fixed width, just because I will only want this to be 80 pixels in width at all given times, regardless of how big the page is. And the same goes for my overall floating group here. So because I only had 400 pixels of margin on the left-hand side of my page, I'm going to leave this floating group at 400 pixels of fixed width. But I'll be updating the minimum height of this element in a moment as well. But within our green group here, before I move on to adding in my media library, what I'd like to do is add in a few different buttons that we're going to be using later on in our build. And when I add those buttons in, I'd like to actually create my own custom buttons using group elements. So by this point, you're probably a little bit confused considering how many different groups I've added onto the page. But as I mentioned, if you just color code your groups like Lego blocks, it's easy to just identify where particular groups sit at all given times. And of course, when you go to publish your application, you can remove the different colors of the groups. But for now, what I'd like to do is add in another group within my green group here. I'm going to jump to my Appearance tab. I will remove the style of this group, and I'll set the background color to be a flat color. And while I'm here, I'm just going to update the roundness of this group to be 10, just because I'm creating some buttons, so I want it to have some curved edges. I'll then jump over into my layout tab here, and I'll update the container layout of this group to be a column. And now when it comes to the width and height of this group, I'm going to set the width to be 60 pixels. I'll be keeping that as a fixed width. And then for the height, I will be setting the height to be 60 pixels. And I'd also like to select that that should be a fixed height. So now you'll see here my group is 60 pixels by 60 pixels. I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right. So that way it sits within the center of my green group. And if I'd like to move this group down on my overall page so it's not touching the top of my page, what I could do is actually select on my blue floating group here and just add in 20 pixels of margin at the top. I might also do the same for my red group in a moment. But just while we're working on our floating group here, you'll now see that it does not touch the top of our page. And then when it comes to the actual button itself, what I'd like to do is add in an icon within this. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements, and I'll be adding an icon element into my white group here. And the first icon I'd like to add in is just going to be a text icon. So I'll type in the word text and I'll just select from this option here. And then of course from here, I'd just like to update the layout size of this icon. The first thing I'd like to do is just align this horizontally in the center of our white group. And then I'm going to update the width of this icon to be 30 pixels and then the height to be 30 pixels. And then I'm going to add in 15 pixels of margin at the top, and it will be positioned in the center of my white group there. And now later on in our tutorial, we'll be building out some workflows that allow this group here to function like a button, which will trigger a workflow whenever it's clicked. But what I'd like to do is actually just create a couple of duplicates of this button, because I'm going to need to cater for all of the different element styles that a user will be able to add onto our overall canvas. And so what I'm going to do is just make a copy of this element. And then I'm going to select on the icon itself that sits within our group. I'm going to jump over to our appearance tab and I'm going to update this to be a mouse icon. So this button here will be used to allow someone to select and move any elements within our overall canvas. I'm also just going to click on the white button itself and I'm going to jump to our layout tab because I just like to add 10 pixels of margin at the top of this element. So that way it doesn't touch the button above it there. I'm then going to need to copy across our button once again, and you'll now see it copies across the margin within it as well. And for the icon within this group, I'm going to jump to our appearance tab and just type in the word circle. And I'd like to add in this full circle here. And this button is going to be used to allow someone to add shapes onto our canvas later on. And then finally, I'm going to make one last copy. And I will select on the icon within this group and I will type in the word pencil so I can search for a pencil icon. And as you probably guessed, this will allow someone to draw on our canvas later on throughout our tutorial. Once I've finished adding in all of the groups I would like to use as buttons, I'm going to click on my green group here, jump to my layout tab, and just set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it's going to collapse around all of my buttons there. And then beside this, what I'd like to do is add in yet another group which is going to house my media library. And so because our overall blue group here has a container layout of a row, whenever I add a group in, it's going to position this to the right hand side if it fits within the dimensions here. So if you remember, the full width of our blue group here is 400 pixels, and the green group within it is 80 pixels. So that means that if I was to add another group in here, it would have to be 320 pixels, because of course 320 plus 80 is 400. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I will add in another group. And before I update the responsive settings of this group, I'm going to head to my appearance tab. I will remove the style of this group. And I would like to update the background color to be a flat color. Only this time I'm going to make this group a light shade of purple there. And now from here I'm going to jump over to our layout tab. And for the container layout of this group, I'm going to set this to be a column, because once again I'll be stacking any of the elements within it from top to bottom, so vertically. And then when it comes to the actual dimensions of this element, I'm going to keep this to be a fixed width, except I'll only just need to update the width dimensions to be 320 pixels. And you'll now see it fits quite nicely within my floating group there. And then within this group, I just like to create a media library experience. So I'm going to start by adding in a way for a user to upload a photo. And then I'd like to display a list of all of the photos they've uploaded within a repeating group. And so I'm going to start by adding in a button element here. So I'm going to select to add in a button, and this will display the words upload media. And now when it comes to the styling of this button, I'm just going to remove the style because I'd like to once again just set this to be a purple color that I have, which if you want that color code again, it's A020F0. And now I'll jump over to my layout tab for this button because I'd like to unselect that this is fixed width, which is just going to expand this button across the full width of our group here. But I will just leave the height to be 45 pixels just because I'm happy with the height of that button there. And now what I'd like to do before I actually display a list of all of the images that a user has uploaded, I want to create a way for a user to be able to upload an image. And the way I'll be doing that is by adding yet another group element into our existing group here. Only this time, this group is actually going to be hidden by default on our page, and it'll only be displayed when someone selects the upload media button here. And so I'm going to scroll on down to our containers menu, and I'm going to add a group into my existing group here. I'll head to my appearance tab, and I'm going to remove the style of this. I'll update the background style to be a flat color, only this time I'm going to keep this to be white. I'll then jump into my layout tab here, and I'll update the container layout of this group to be a column. And when it comes to the responsive settings, I'm going to unselect that this group should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, which just means our group is now going to take up all of the space that it possibly can here. I'll be updating the minimum height in a moment. But when it comes to the elements within this group, I'd like to add in a picture upload element as well as an additional button. But before I do that, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this group here. So that way it's not directly touching the button element. And then from here, I'm going to add in a picture uploader element. So if I head to my input forms, I'm going to scroll on down to the picture uploader option. I will add that into my group here. And I'll be updating the name of this to be called Picture Uploader New Media. And of course, I'd like this picture uploader to expand across the full width of my group here. So I'm going to unselect that this should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. And if I really wanted, I could update the height of this to be 180 pixels, but I will leave this as fixed height, just because I don't want this group getting any larger than 180 pixels. And then finally, I'm just going to need to add in another button element below this picture uploader. So I'm going to copy my existing button here. I'm going to select my white group, and I'll paste that button in. And this is just going to display the word upload. So I'm just going to remove the word media there. Under my layout settings though, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of this button and 10 pixels of margin at the bottom. And then from here, I'm just going to select the white group that it sits within. And I'm going to now set the minimum height of that group to be 0. So that way it will collapse around all of the elements within it there. And as I mentioned, I'm actually not going to want this group to be displayed by default. I'd like it to instead be hidden on our page. And I'd only want it to be displayed when the upload media button here is clicked. In which case, I'd like this group to open up and allow someone to upload an image. And so what I'm going to do is head over to my layout tab here, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. And I'll be selecting this option to collapse its height when it's hidden, which just means that when this group is not being displayed, any other elements below it will move up and take its place. And then what I'd also like to do is select the option to animate its collapse operation. And I'm just going to leave this as the slide up, slide down option, which essentially just means that when we do select the upload media button, it's going to slide this group down. And of course, in order to display this group, we're going to need to build out a workflow to do so. So I'm going to jump over to my upload media button here, and I'm going to head to my appearance tab. And then I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this button is clicked. And what I'd like to do is just type in the word toggle, and I want to toggle an element, which just means I want to either display it or hide it. And the element will be our group, which is our white group. And now this is probably a bad example of how you should build bubble applications, but I haven't given any naming conventions to my groups here. So it's just group A, B, C, D, and so on. It's probably best practice to actually name your groups independently. So that way when you're creating workflows like this, you actually know which group is which. In this case though, when I hover over group H, I can see that that is the group itself that I want to toggle. So I am going to select that. If I then jump back into my design tab, the last thing I'd like to add within our purple group here is just a repeating group that displays a full list of images that have been uploaded to our Canva project. And so I'm going to scroll up to our containers menu. I'm going to add a repeating group within my purple group here. So because I can see there's some space here, I'm going to click there and it will automatically add that to the bottom of my purple group. And because my purple group has the option selected to fit the height of its content to the elements within it, it's going to automatically expand down. And now when it comes to the configurations of this repeating group, before I update any of the layout settings, we're going to first need to update the type of content that we'd like to display within it. And now in this case, we're going to need to create just an additional data type within our database. And in my application, I've jumped ahead and I've actually already done this, but what I'd like to do is just walk you through the additional data types you'll need to add. So if I open up my data tab here, you'll see I have a data type called image. Don't worry about any of the additional data types I've added here. These are for separate projects. But what you will need to add is a new data type called an image. And then within that, you'll need to create a data field called image, and that will be an image property. So just to reiterate, you'd create a field, you'd call this an image, and you'd set the field type to be an image type. I'm not going to create that again though, because I already have created it. But if I jump back into my design tab, I'm going to need to update the type of content that I'd like to display within my repeating group to be an image data type. And then when it comes to the data source, I'm going to perform a search through my database for all of the images that were created by the current user. So I'll select the created by equals the current user option. And now that's just going to display a list of all of the images that this person has uploaded. And then from here, because I've configured my repeating group, I can now update the responsive settings of it. So I'm going to jump over into my layout tab here. I'm going to first update its layout style to be a column. And then for the width of this, I'm going to unselect this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Later on, I'll be updating the height. But the only other thing I'd like to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin at the bottom. And I can notice that we're unable to see the bottom of our repeating group. And that's just because I'm just going to need to expand the height of my page out. So if I just click on this gray section, I'll be able to see my overall page. I can see the minimum height is currently 600. I'm just going to make that 1000 for the time being. Of course, we can update that again before we actually preview or publish our application. I'm then going to click on our repeating group again here though, because I'm going to jump over into my appearance tab. Because within this tab, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows, as well as unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. And from here, I'm just going to update the minimum height to be 150, as well as the minimum width to be 150. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just want a bit of extra space to work within for the time being. If I end up needing more or less space, I can of course just come back and tinker with these options. But we'll just see how that goes for the time being. So what I'd like to do is now add in an image element to this repeating group. So I'm going to head up to my visual elements. I will add in an image. And for this image, I'm going to insert dynamic data. And I'm just going to display the current cell's image, the image data field. And while I'm working on this image, I'm also just going to give it a solid border, just so that way I can see where it sits within my actual repeating group. I'll then jump over to my layout tab here because I'll need to update the dimensions of this image. And before I do that, I'm just going to align this image in the center of our repeating group cell. I will unselect that this image should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. And then when it comes to the height of this element, I just want to set the minimum height to be 100. And if I was to leave the maximum height as infinite, it's going to just scale down based on how much height is required for each individual image. And the only other thing I'd like to change is just the margin around this image. I just like to add 10 pixels of margin around each border of this image, so that way it's not touching the repeating group itself. And then of course, once I've added all of the elements that I'd like within my repeating group, I can select on the repeating group itself because I'd like to remove this empty space at the bottom of it there. So I'm going to head to my layout tab of my repeating group and set the minimum height to be 0. And then I'll jump to my appearance tab here, and I'll need to update the minimum height of each row to be 120 pixels. And the reason why it's 120 is of course because the minimum height of our image is 100 pixels, and I have both 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin at the bottom, which equals 120 pixels in total. And what you'll now see is that that repeating group, it collapses quite nicely around the actual image itself. And of course, if a user has added multiple images, this repeating group will just indefinitely scale down our whole page. But if you'd like to create an experience where, similar to Canva's product, it displays a list of images, and instead of indefinitely pushing the page down, you can just scroll within this section of our media library here. You can create that by just selecting that you should have a fixed number of rows. So I'd just like to show you the option of creating both experiences. So if you'd like to leave this repeating group as is, it will currently continually expand down our page and display all of the images at once. Whereas if you want to create the experience where you only display a select number at once and then allow the user to scroll within that repeating group, what you just need to do is select that this is a fixed number of rows, and you could leave this at 4, and then you could select that it's a fixed number of columns, and you could leave this at 2. And so now it will only display 8 images, but a user could scroll within this repeating group itself to view the rest of the images. And so I'm actually going to leave it at this option here, because what I'd like to do now is just explain how we can build out a workflow to upload an image into our media library, and then how we can add an image from our media library onto our actual canvas. And in order to upload an image, I'm going to select our upload button here. I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this, I'd like to head to our data tab because I want to create a new thing in my database. The thing I want to create is of course a new image. And I'll be setting the data field value of the image that's attached to this to be the value of our picture uploader, new media. And then once a new image has been uploaded, I just like to add a few additional steps to this workflow. The first is that I would like to reset the value of the picture that's stored within our picture uploader. So at this point in time, if a user was to upload an image, it would now add it into our repeating group, but that image would still remain put within our picture uploader. So what I'm going to do is jump over into my workflow editor here. I will add an additional step within this workflow, and I'm just going to type in the word reset, and I'll be able to select this option here to reset relevant inputs, and that's just going to reset the value of the picture uploader itself. And then finally, what I'd like to do is just toggle the group that displays my picture uploader away. So I'm just going to type in the word toggle here. I'd like to toggle an element, and that element will be my group H, which is our picture uploader element. So that's now just going to hide this group again once an image has been uploaded. And just like that, that's how we can create an experience that allows a user to not only upload images, but also display a list of all of the images they've uploaded within their media library. And of course, in a moment, I'll be explaining how we can build out a workflow that allows a user to add an image onto our overall canvas here. But for the time being, what I'd like to do is just jump over into my Notion checklist here. And I'm just going to check off that we've finished not only building out the initial page structure itself, but I've also explained how you can upload and display images within your media library. And of course, once we've created a way to upload and display those images, we're going to need to build out a way to actually import those images into our canvas on the page. And thankfully, this is actually a very straightforward process. All we have to do is build out a relatively simple workflow. So if we jump back into our bubble editor here, what I'd like to do is click on the image that sits within our repeating group within our media library. And what I'd like to do is create a workflow that's triggered every single time an image from our repeating group is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to add an action. I'm going to type in the words add, and then you'll see the option here to add an image to the canvas on your page. I will select that. And then within this workflow step, what we'll need to do is import a dynamic image value that will be added into our canvas. And when we're adding an image onto our canvas through this workflow, we're just going to need to identify which particular image we would like to import. And in this case, it's going to be the image that we're clicking within our repeating group. So for the dynamic image value here, I would like this to be the current cell's image. And I'll of course be selecting from its image data field, which is just the photo itself. You can, if you would like, customize the X and Y values in which the image is placed within the canvas. I'm just going to leave these as 10 and 10 at the moment. What I am going to do though is just update the dimensions for the image width and height. Just because if an image is quite large, I don't want it to actually be larger than the canvas itself. So when an image is added, I'm just going to set it to be 200 pixels in width and 200 pixels in height. And just like that, that's all we need to build in order to add an image into our canvas. What I'd like to do though now, before we move on, is to show you a quick preview of everything we've built so far. So I'm going to open up my home page that we had previously created. And then I'm going to run a preview of this logged into an account that I have created. And so in order to do that, I'm going to head over to my data tab. I'll open up my app data, and then at the bottom, I'm just going to select on my all users option, and then I'll see this choice to run my application as this user I have previously created. So I'm going to run this, and over on our homepage here, you'll see that there's currently no projects being displayed, and that is of course because I have not yet created a project within our database. And so in order to create my first project, I'm going to select the Create a Design button, and our pop-up will appear. I'm just going to call this Test Project 1. And for this project, I'm just going to set the height as 400 pixels and the width as 800 pixels, just because that is the dimensions of the actual canvas itself on my page. If I choose to create this project here, that workflow will run. And then over on my project page, what you'll see is that because I have previously uploaded some images within my media library, these are currently being displayed within my repeating group. On the left-hand side, I also have all of my different groups, which will act as buttons in a moment. And then, of course, I have a blank canvas here. And now, while we're working within our application, one thing I'd recommend doing is just setting a border around your canvas, just so that way you can actually see where it sits on your page. So if I was to jump into my bubble editor and select on my canvas element, what I'd like to do is just scroll right on down to the bottom of our element inspector here and just add a solid border around my canvas. So that way when I refresh this page here, we'll actually see where my canvas actually fits on the page itself. And now by default, you'll be able to draw on this canvas here. And I'll be explaining how we can change the different modes and options of our canvas in a moment. But the first thing I just wanted to show you is how we can add an image into our canvas. So if I wanted to upload an image, I could select this button here. It would toggle our picture uploader element. And from here, I could select to upload an image from my local device. And then I could choose to upload this. It's going to close our group there, and it will add that image to our picture library here. And then if we wanted to select one of these images to add it onto our canvas, we could just click this, and that image would now appear on our actual canvas itself. And so this just gives you a general idea of where we are throughout the building process so far. Of course, from here, there's so many additional features that we still need to add, as well as some additional page structuring we need to take care of. So I'm just going to close this tab here, and I'm going to jump back into my Notion checklist and just check off that we have created the ability to import images from our image library directly into our canvas. And now from here, what I'd like to do is build out the workflow that will allow us to change the background color of the canvas itself. And so in order to do that, I'm going to need to jump back into my bubble editor here. And above where our canvas sits on the page, I'd like to add a horizontal menu across the top of my page, which is going to include a list of additional buttons and icons that will provide some functionality for the canvas itself. But before I do that, I'm just going to want to move my red group that my canvas sits in down on my page, so that way it's in line with the floating group on my page as well. And so in order to select my red group, I'm going to click on my canvas. I will then right select and choose to select its first parent. And now the parent is the group that the canvas sits within. So you can see here that we've selected our red group. And then what I'd like to do within this group is head over to my layout tab here. And I'm going to add a margin at the top of this group. And I'll just set this to be 20 pixels. And now it will be aligned with the floating group on my page. And now while we're here, what I'd also like to do is just update the minimum height of this group to be 450 pixels. And I'll be changing this in a moment, but the reason why I wanted to do that is because I'm about to add another group into our red group here. And because our canvas is 400 pixels in height, I just need a little bit of empty space here, so that way I can actually insert an element into this group. And the element I'd like to insert is going to be another group that will act as a horizontal menu. And so I'm going to scroll on down to our containers menu, and I'll choose to add another group within our red group here. I'm going to jump over to our appearance tab, and the first thing I'm going to do is just remove the style of this group, because I'd like to set the background style to be a flat color, and I'm happy with just leaving this group as a white color. I'm then going to want to update the responsive settings of this group. So I want it to stretch out and fit the full width that it has available here. So I'm going to head to my layout tab. And the first thing I'm going to do before I update the responsive settings is just update the container layout. So because I'd like to display a list of buttons and elements within this group horizontally across our page, I'm going to update the container layout to be a row. I'll then scroll on down to my width option and unselect that this should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then later on, after I add my elements into this group, I'll come back and update the minimum height. But in order to make this group positioned at the top of my page, I'm just going to select this option here to make it the first element within our red group. And then from here, what I'd like to do is just add in the element that I'd like to display the current background color of my canvas, before I then create a drop-down menu that allows someone to select from a color picker and choose to update the background color itself. And so in order to display almost like a palette of the current color that's been selected, I'm going to add in yet another group element. I'm sure you're probably sick of me adding groups into my page at this point in time. When it comes to this group, I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab here and just choose to remove the style of it. Because in this case, I want to update the background style to be a flat color. Only this time, instead of adding in a manual color code, what I'd like to do is reference the background color data field we've stored in our database. So if I choose to insert dynamic data, I would like to display the current page project. So that's the project we're working on within this page. Its background color, which if you remember is just a text field, which will allow us to store a color code. While I'm working on this group, I'd also just like to set a solid border around it. And then I'm going to jump over to our layout tab here. I'm going to update the container layout to be a column. And then for the width of this element, I'm going to set this to be 40 pixels. And I will leave this as fixed width. And for the height, I'd also like this to be 40 pixels. And I'll be setting this to be a fixed height. So essentially, I'm going to want this group to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels at all times. I'm then going to choose to center this vertically within our overall white group here. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin on the bottom, as well as 10 pixels of margin on the left. And now that I've added an element within my overall white group here, I can select on that group itself, and I can update the minimum height to now be 0, and it will collapse nicely around the element that we've added into it, because it has selected this option here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. And you'll now see how this looks as a header menu across the top of our page here above our canvas element. And so what I'd like to do from here is just create almost like a drop-down experience where when a user selects on the current color that's being displayed in our background for this canvas, I'd like to display a group on our page that has a color picker within it. And so in order to create that experience, I'm going to need to add in not a regular group, but something called a focus group. And so you'll see here there is an element under our containers menu called a group focus element. I'm going to add this anywhere on our page and it'll appear in the top left hand corner. And now the difference between a focus group and a regular group is that a focus group acts much like a floating group. So it's actually not positioned on our page, it's positioned over the top of our page. But what sets it aside from any other group element is that you can pin a focus group to an existing element on your page. So I'm going to select my group here that displays my background color, and I can update the name of this to be called group background color, just so that way I know what to reference when I then select on my focus group here. And so if I was to open up my reference element tab here, I could select the group background color element. And what you'll find is that now, regardless of where I am on my page, this focus group is going to be pinned to my color group here. And when it comes to this focus group itself, I'm going to update the name of this to be called group focus background color. And if I'd like, I could remove the style of this group and just set the background style to be a white background. And then I'll jump over into my layout settings because I'd like to customize the container layout for this group. I'd like it to be a column. And then finally, when it comes to the width of this group, I'm going to set this to be 240 pixels in width, just because I know that when I add a color picker element into this, it's also going to be 240 pixels. And then finally, for the height, I'd like to set this to be 200 pixels, and I will be selecting that this is a fixed height. So now our group will always remain this particular size. And now that I have finished configuring the dimensions of this group, I can add my color picker element that will sit within it. So I'm going to scroll on up here, and one of my favorite things about the Fabric.JS plugin is that it also comes with a color picker element that you can leverage. So I'm going to select the canvas color picker element, and I'll add this within our focus group here. But before I make any changes to the dimensions of this color picker, I'm going to update the name to be canvas color picker, background color. And then for the dimensions of this color picker, I'm going to set the width to be 200 pixels and the height to be 200 pixels. And one thing I will point out is that you will see that it fits quite nicely within my focus group here, but there's some additional white space on the side. And the reason I'm adding that is because when you're working with the canvas color picker, the actual color selector itself is 200 pixels in width, but there's an additional 40 pixels that you just need to factor in for that allows you to slide between different color variations. And you'll see that in a moment when I show you a preview of how this functions. But while I'm working on our color picker here, what I'd like to do is create a workflow every single time the value of this color picker is changed, in which case I'd like to then update the background color that's displayed within our canvas in our project. And in order to build out that workflow, we're just going to need to create a manual trigger on our page. So I'm going to jump over into my workflow editor here, and I'm going to select to create a brand new workflow from scratch. I'll scroll on down to my element triggers here. And what you'll see is there's an option to create a workflow whenever the value of a color picker on our page has been changed. So I'm going to select this option here. And by default, because I only have one color picker on my page at this point in time, it's going to reference the background color picker. I'm then going to jump into my workflow actions, and I'd just like to head to my data tab, because essentially what I'd like to do is update the background color that's stored in this project, and I want it to equal the same value that's being selected on our color picker. So if I head to our data tab, I'm going to choose to make changes to a thing. The thing I would like to change is the current page project we're working on. And in this case, I'd like to update the background color to equal the value of our color picker background color. its value, which is of course going to be a color code, which we can then reference to display on our canvas itself in a moment. But once I've built out this workflow, there is another workflow I'm going to need to create, and that is the ability to actually toggle our focus group on and off. One thing I will just point out is that if you were to refresh the page, what you'll find is that your focus group will be positioned to the top left-hand corner. If you were to select the color picker and choose its first parent, which is the actual focus group itself, what you'll see is that the reference element is still set to be our background color picker. So when we preview our application, it will be placed within the correct position. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is just select on our group background color here. I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this group is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word toggle because I'd like to toggle an element. And that element will, of course, be our focus group that we have. So if I scroll on down, you'll see the option to select from our focus group here. So our group focus background color. And then before we can take a preview of how this functions, there's one last thing I'd like to do, and that is actually just select on my canvas itself here. And I'd like to update the value that's stored within our background color field here. So I'm going to select in this field and I will insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current page project, its background color. And so from here, what I want to do is just take a quick preview at how this is going to function within our actual project we created before. So I'm just going to run a preview of my application here. And over in the project that I had previously created, as you can see by default, there's currently no background color on this particular canvas. But if I was to select on our group here, it's going to toggle on our focus group, in which I can now see my color picker is being displayed. If I would like, I could choose to update the background color here. And then every single time we change the color that's being selected within our color picker here, our workflow is going to run and it's going to update the background color that's stored in our database, which of course will then be reflected within our group here, as well as the actual background itself. And of course I can toggle this color selector away if I would like. And this group here is just going to permanently display the color of the background, just so that way you have a reference at any given point in time. But that's everything I want to cover when it comes to updating the background color. As you can see, our project's coming along quite nicely at this point in time. So what I'm going to do is jump back over into my Notion doc here, and I'm going to check off that we've finished building out the feature to update the background color of our project. And once we finish updating the background color here, you can start to see we're making our way through the build quite nicely. The next feature I'd like to add is the ability to add text into the actual canvas itself. So let's say if a user wants to add a heading within their image, this will allow them to do that. And now there's a little bit involved within this particular step of our build. So what I'm going to do is just jump over into my bubble editor here. And I'm just going to start by explaining the difference between all of the different menu options that I've added on the far left-hand side of our page. So if you remember, when we were creating the page, I'd added these 4 groups that I said were going to act like buttons on our page. And as I walk you through these different groups, I'm going to update the names of them. So this group element here, when it's clicked, will give us the ability to add text onto our canvas. And so I'm going to call this group text. And then the next group, which displays the mouse icon, will just allow a user to drag and resize any elements on the actual canvas itself. So I'm going to be calling this group select, because when it's clicked, it will allow users to select any elements on the canvas. Then our group below this with the circle in it will allow us to add shapes onto our canvas. So I'm going to call this group shape. And then finally, we have our last group with the pencil icon in it, which when clicked will allow a user to draw on a canvas. So I'm going to update the name of this to be called group draw. And now one thing I would like to point out is that if I click on my actual canvas here and open up my appearance tab, if I was to scroll on down through my settings here, you'll see a ton of different options that you can customize. But one thing in particular that I'm interested in showing you is the option here to update the cursor click mode. So if I was to open up this drop down menu, you'll see a whole suite of different options that will allow us to update the behavior that occurs within a canvas when a user selects in it. And by default, this value is set to be the free draw / paint option, which is why when I took a preview of my application, you could see I had the ability to draw on it. But what I'd like to do before I add our text onto our page is just create a way to update the canvas's click mode every single time one of these buttons is clicked on the left-hand side of our menu. And then eventually what I'd like to do is explain how when our text button is clicked, it will allow us to not only update our cursor mode, but also just automatically add text onto our canvas. And so in order to create the functionality to update the cursor mode, we're going to need to leverage some custom states on our page. And if you're not familiar with custom states, they're just a way to temporarily store data on your page without having to store or reference anything in your database. And that's perfect for what we need, because essentially whenever someone clicks on our select group here, I just want to temporarily store a value on our page that just references that we should update our cursor mode to be the select elements option. And so in order to add those custom states, we're going to click on our overall page here. So this is just the gray element in the background, and this should be called Canva Project. And then if we open up this information icon here, you'll see we have the ability to add in some custom states. And so I'm going to need to create a custom state for each of my different cursor modes here. And so I'm going to start by creating a new custom state, and this will be called Draw Mode. And for this state, I'm going to be setting the state type to be a yes or no option, because we either are going to be in draw mode or we aren't. I'll choose to create that. And now because I'd also like the draw mode to be enabled on my canvas by default, I'm going to set the default value of this to equal yes. And then of course I'll be setting the default values of my different cursor modes to be no. And so I'm just going to need to add in the different cursor mode options now. So I'm going to add another custom state, and I'll call this one select mode. Once again, I'll be setting the state type to be a yes/no option. I'll choose to create that. Only this time I'll be setting the default value to be no, because when the page is loaded by default, I don't want the select mode to be activated. I'm then going to create another custom state, and I'll call this shape mode. I'll set the state of this to be yes/no. I'll create this. And then once again, I'll be setting the default value to be no. And then finally, I will add in a last custom state, and this will be called text mode. So this is the cursor mode that's going to allow someone to add text onto our canvas. And I'll set this state type to be yes, no. And then once I've created that, I can set the default value to also be no. And then what I'd like to do from here is create a workflow that runs every single time one of our buttons is clicked here, in which case I'll just be updating the custom state for its cursor mode. But when we update the cursor mode of our text element, I'd like to add an additional step to that workflow that automatically adds some text onto my canvas. But I'll save that for last because I want to just give you a basic understanding of how we're going to set the custom states first. So in order to get started, I'm going to select on my group here, which is the group draw, so the one with my pencil icon. And what I'm going to want to do is create a workflow every single time this group is clicked. And so if I scroll on up, I'm going to choose to start a workflow when this group is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word state, and I'd like to set the state of an element. The element I would like to set the state of is our overall page. So in my case, it's called Canva Project. And then what I'd like to do is select on my draw mode custom state, and I'll be setting the value of this to be yes. And now one thing I would just like to point out is that if the value is currently already set to yes, it's just going to leave it at yes. It's not going to make any drastic changes. But while we're setting the state of our draw mode to be yes, I'd like to update the values of all of my other custom states to be no. So that way I can ensure that only one cursor mode can be activated at once. So I'm going to choose to set another custom state here, and I'll be selecting from each of the custom states in my list. So next up is my select mode. I'd like to make sure the value of this equals no. Then from here, there was our shape mode. I'll want its value to also be no. And then finally, there is our text mode, and I will want its value to also be no. And now that's just going to ensure that when our draw mode is clicked, it is the only cursor mode that is active. And from here, what I'll need to do is essentially just replicate this workflow for each of my different buttons on my page here. So when my shape mode button is selected, I'll just update all of the custom states, switching the shape mode custom state to yes and any other custom state to no. And in order to streamline that whole process, I'm just going to make a copy of this existing workflow I just created. But before I do this, I'm just going to update the event color of this to be red, just because when I duplicate this workflow 4 times, it'll just allow me to differentiate between where they are on my page in comparison to all of my other workflows. And so now I'm going to choose to copy this workflow. I'm going to paste it in again. Only on this workflow, I want to update the element that's clicked as the trigger. So in this case, I want the element to be our group shape. And for our element actions, I'm essentially just going to want to set the shape mode state to be yes. And then I'll just need to make sure that I turn my draw mode state to be no. So now at this point in time, only my select mode state should be yes, and the rest should be no. From here, I'm going to need to create another copy of this because I want to update the custom state when my group select is also clicked. So if I jump back into my workflow, I'm going to paste in another version of this workflow. Only this time I'm going to update the event trigger to be the group select option. So when the group select is clicked, I'm going to head to my custom states. And I'm going to, first of all, set the select mode to be yes, and then set the draw mode to be no. I've also just realized that with my previous custom state for my shape mode workflow, I'd accidentally selected the select mode option, not the shape mode option. I do apologize. I'm just going to update that. So just to reiterate, the shape mode cursor type should be set to yes when the group shape is clicked, and any other value should be set to no. And for our select mode, only the select mode option should be yes and the rest should be no. And then finally, the very last workflow I'll need to create is one whenever our text group is clicked here. Except for this particular workflow, things are going to be a little bit different because when this button is clicked, I don't want to just set the cursor mode value to be text. What I'd like to do is show you how we can create a way to automatically add text onto our canvas without having to actually click on the canvas itself. And so I'm going to select on our text button element here. I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time it's clicked. And then within this workflow, I'm going to add a step here. I'm just going to type in the word add, and you'll see the very last option allows us to add text to our canvas. And within this step of our workflow, you can customize any of the formatting of this text. So you can update the default text. It's just going to say sample text, as well as the position, the size, the color, and even the height of the element that's added onto our canvas. I'm just going to leave all of these options as default for now, because what I'd also like to do is add an additional step within my workflow here that updates the custom state of our cursor mode. And of course, what I'd like to do is set the cursor mode to be the text mode, which could just allow a user to add some additional text onto our canvas itself. And so I'm going to add an additional step here. And within this step of our workflow, I'm going to type in the word state because I'd like to set the state of an element. That element, of course, is our Canva project, which is the full page. And the custom state I'd like to set first is going to be our text mode state. I'd like this to equal yes. And then I'm going to define the rest of my custom states. So our draw mode state should equal no. And then our select mode state should also equal no. And then finally, our shape mode state should also equal no. And because this workflow allows us to update the cursor mode, I'm going to click on the workflow trigger itself here, and I'm going to update the event color to be red, so that way I can just see my 4 workflows here that are updating my cursor modes. And before we take a preview of how this functions within our application, there is one very last thing we'll need to do, and that is jump over into our design tab. And we're going to need to select on our canvas, and we're going to actually need to create a way for our canvas to respond to the custom states that we've added on our page. And so, as I mentioned before, by default, the canvas on our page, its cursor mode is going to be selected as the free draw option. And what I'd like to do is essentially just add a series of different conditions onto my canvas that just recognizes when the states of our page have changed. And I'd like to update the cursor mode field to correspond with the option that's currently set to yes. And so I'm going to head over to my conditional tab here, and I'd like to define a new condition. And I'm going to recognize when the custom state on our overall page. So if I scroll right on down, I'll see the option here to add a condition when our overall page. And then from here, I can select which custom state mode I'd like to select from. So when our draw mode custom state is currently yes, what I'd like to do is type in the word cursor, and then I can update the cursor click mode, in which case I will leave this as the free draw option. I'm then going to define another custom state. This time I'm just going to once again just search for my overall page, which is called Canva project. And I'm going to identify when the select mode state is set to yes. And in this case, I'm just going to set the behavior as once again our cursor click mode. Only this time I'm going to select the cursor click mode to be our select elements option. Then from here, I'm going to define another custom state. I'll search for our overall page. And in this case, I'll be selecting from our shape mode custom state. When its value is yes, I'm going to update the behavior of our cursor click mode. And I would like to set this to be the draw shape option. And then finally, there is the text option. So I'm going to once again type in my overall page. I'm going to recognize when the text mode custom state is currently set to yes. I'd like to update the cursor click mode here, and I'll be selecting from the add text option. And just like that, that's how we can update the behavior of our canvas within our application. What I'd love to do is just jump over into my bubble editor with the project that I had previously created. I'm just going to choose to refresh this page here. And now by default, what you'll see is that because our draw mode custom state is set to yes, I have the ability to draw on my canvas. But let's say I'd like to select from one of my other options here. So if I want to click on my shape mode custom state, it will automatically run that workflow and update the value stored on my page. And now I can drag and add shapes onto my actual canvas. And then if I would like, I could even select my text button here. It's automatically going to add some text onto my canvas. I could update what this displays. And let's say I want to move that text around. I could then choose my select mode button. And this will just allow me to drag different elements across my canvas, as well as give me the ability to resize these as well. And now one thing I will point out is that at this point in time, we're just adding some basic text and shapes onto our page. If you'd like the ability to customize which particular shapes are added, for instance, you can do this by updating all of the values within the canvas's appearance. So if we were to head to our appearance tab and scroll on down, you'll see all of these default options here, which determines the color of our draw mode, as well as the shape type when a shape is added, or even the color and size of our text. And in our tutorial today, I'm going to be explaining how we can customize the values of the text that's added onto our page. But of course, by creating some custom menus of your own, you can completely customize the shape type or even the color of the draw mode paint on the page. The possibilities really are endless, which is what I love about the Fabric.JS plugin. And if you ever find yourself needing some additional instructions throughout that process, I'd recommend heading over to the documentation page added within the Fabric.JS plugin page. So you'll see here there is a list of step-by-step instructions for how to use this plugin. And if you just scroll on down, you'll see there is a list of detailed instructions for pretty much anything you can think of when it comes to updating the values stored on your canvas. In the meantime though, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist here. And I'm going to tick off that we finished adding in the feature to add text into our canvas. And we have actually also skipped ahead and we've updated the ability to set the different cursor mode custom states across our page. So I'm also just going to tick those off. But the next thing I'd like to cover is how we can actually edit the existing text that we've added onto our overall canvas. And there's a little bit involved in this process, so I'm going to be sure to walk you through everything in as much detail as I possibly can. But essentially from here, we're going to jump back over into our bubble editor. And what I'd like to do is create a group within my main header group here that just includes yet another color selection group like the one we'd added for our background color, as well as a few different buttons that will allow a user to either increase or decrease the size of a selected font. And so I'll start by walking us through the process of how we'll actually need to design that group. And so I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here, and I'll choose to add yet another group within my main header group here. And I'd like to actually give a name to this group. I want to call it group edit text. And while we're working on this group, I'm just going to update the color of it so that way I can see where it actually sits in our main header group here. So I'm going to remove the style of this group, update the background style to be a flat color, and I will set the color to just be a light shaded blue for the time being. And then from here, I'm going to jump over into the layout tab of this group because I'll need to update the layout style. And within this group, I'm going to add a couple of different elements that will be stacked horizontally. So I'm going to be updating the container layout to be a row. And then before I actually make any changes to the width or the height of this group, I'm just going to start by adding in all of the different elements and buttons I'd like to include within this group. And the first is that I'd like to include a similar group to our background color picker here. So if someone would like to update the color of the text that they've selected, I'm just going to include a group here that will display a preview of what the color is. And then if they were to select on that group, I'd like to display yet another color picker. So I'm going to add another group within my overall blue group here. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called group text color preview. And then I'm going to jump over into our appearance tab here. I will remove the style of this group. I will set the background style to be a flat color, although I will be leaving it as white for now. The only thing I would like to do is just add a solid border around this, so that way I can see where it's going to sit within my overall blue group. I'm then going to jump into my layout tab here, and I'd like to update the container layout to be a column. And then when it comes to the actual size of this group, I am going to keep this fixed width, but I'm going to set this to be 30 pixels in width. And then I'm going to also select that I'd like this to be a fixed height, and I'm going to make this 30 pixels in height. I'll also then vertically align this in the center of my overall blue group. And what you'll see is that the group for our text color is going to be a little bit smaller than our background group, which is exactly what we'd want. But once we've added this smaller group onto our page, what I'd like to do is add yet another focus group onto our page, similar to the previous focus group we've added for our background color picker here. And I'd like to replicate the experience where when our text color group here is clicked, it should open up yet another focus group and display a color picker for a user to determine which color they would like their text to be. And so in order to streamline that process, I'm going to open up my elements tree here. I'm going to select this option here to only show hidden items. And then at the bottom, I'll see the option to open up my focus group here on the page. And this focus group is of course linked to my very first color group here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called group focus text color. And if I jump over into my appearance tab here, I'm just going to update the reference element here. And I will move the reference from being our group background color to now be our group text color preview. And that will just move this item across. I'm also going to select my color picker that sits within this focus group. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called Canvas Color Picker Text Color. And then I'm just going to jump back into my elements tree and select the eye icon next to my background color. And that will just hide that focus group while we're working on our new one here. And now in a moment, we're going to create a way to store the value of a color within this particular group here. So that way we can reference the color preview in this group. But before I do that, I'd just like to create the workflow that toggles this focus group on. So I'm going to select on my group here for our text color preview. I will choose to start a new workflow every single time this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to toggle an element. And that element will just be our group focus text color. And for the time being, I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll also just choose to hide this focus group on our page for now while I build out the rest of my menu here. Because the next thing I'd like to add within my menu is just a way to display a font size, as well as have two icons placed on each side of that particular element, which when clicked will either increase or decrease the size of the selected font. And what I'd like to do is group all of those elements together, just so that way they're separate from our initial color picker group here. So I'm going to add in yet another group here within my blue container. And the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this. I'm going to call it group text size menu, because this will be housing the items we need to update the size of a text element in our canvas. And then while we're working on this group, I'm just going to once again remove the style of this, update the background color to be a flat color, and I could just update this to be a light shade of green for the time being, just of course so I can see where it actually sits within my other groups here. And now when it comes to the layout of this group, I'm going to want to set this to be a row, because I'll be stacking some elements in this horizontally, so side to side. And I'll also be updating the width and height in a moment, but first of all, I'd just like to add in my 3 elements. So there'll be 2 icon elements and 1 input field. And so if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I can add an icon element into our group here. And I'm just going to search for a minus icon here. I will select this option with the full square. And I'm going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to update the width of this icon to be 30 pixels and have the height to be 30 pixels. And I'll keep both of these sizes fixed width, because I won't want this icon to either increase or decrease in size. I want it to permanently stay 30 pixels by 30 pixels. Beside this, I'm then going to add in an input field, and this is going to allow a user to manually update the size of a text element. So I'm going to choose to add an input field into my group here. I'm going to call this input text size, and we will need to make some alterations to the initial content that this displays in a moment. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump over into my layout tab here. And I'd like to update the height of this text field to be 30 pixels. And I'll be keeping that as a fixed height. And then when it comes to the width, I will update this to be 50 pixels. And I'll also be keeping that as a fixed width. I could also vertically align this in the center of my green group. And I'll do the same for our minus icon here. And then finally, I'm just going to copy my minus icon. I'm then going to head to my layout tab and move this to the next position within my green group. And then I'll jump over to my appearance tab and I'll update this icon to, instead of being a minus icon, I'd like it to be a plus icon. And so now you can see that we're going to display the size of a text within this input field. And when a user wants to either make the text smaller, they can hit the minus icon. And when they want to enlarge that text, they could hit the plus icon. And now once I've finished configuring the layout of our green group here, I'm going to select on it again and jump back over into our layout tab. And then from here, I'm going to update the width of this group to be 110 pixels. And the reason I'm doing that is because now that I've finished adding my elements into this group itself, I can make a calculation of how long the width will be. So both of my icon elements are 30 pixels. So together they create 60 pixels of width. And then I have an input field here, which is 50 pixels of width. And when you add all of those together, you get 110 pixels in width. And then for our minimum height of this group, I'm going to set this to be 0. And now it will collapse that around all of our elements there. And of course, for the overall green group itself, I would like to vertically align this within our blue group. And I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left for this group here. And then I can jump over into my overall blue group, and I can also update the minimum height here to be 0, and that will now collapse this around all of the elements that sit within it. I'm going to vertically align this in the center of our header group here, and then I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left. And then when it comes to the width of this group, I know that all of the elements within my green group are 110 pixels. I also have 10 pixels of margin between the group and our first group here. And then this group here is 30 pixels in width. So therefore, I know that if I was to add all of those widths together, I would have 150 pixels. So I'm going to keep this to be a fixed width and set the width itself to be 150 pixels. And that will now collapse nicely around all of the elements themselves. But while we're working on this group, what I'd also like to do is actually make this group not visible when our page is loaded, just because I'd only like this group here to be displayed when the cursor mode of our overall canvas is set to be the select mode. And the reason why I'm choosing to do that is because let's say someone adds a text element onto our actual canvas. If they'd like to reposition or resize it, they're more than likely going to update the cursor mode to be the select mode, and then they'll drag it around and update the size of it. And so what I'm going to want to do is only display this group here when the cursor mode is currently set as the select mode. And now if you just like to permanently display this group in your header menu here, you don't have to add this condition that I'm about to add onto this group. But if you would like to hide it and only display it when the select mode is active, what you'll do is you'll click on your overall blue group. We'll head to the layout tab here, and we're going to unselect that this element is visible on page load. We're also going to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. And then we're going to jump over to our conditional tab here, and we'll define a new condition. And for this condition, we're going to recognize when the state on our overall page. So we're going to need to scroll on down to our overall page, which is our Canva project. When its select mode state is set to yes, I would like to select that this group should be visible and tick that that should be true. And now one other thing I would just like to preference is that because we are displaying this group when the select mode is yes, after someone selects our text button here and automatically adds some text onto our canvas, you could almost assume that they're going to want to edit the positioning and size of that immediately. So what we could do is we could select on our text button here, head to our appearance tab, and open up the workflow that adds the text onto our canvas. And if you remember, within this workflow, we had two steps. The first was that we were adding the actual text onto our canvas. And then the second was that we were setting the state of our text mode to equal yes. Whereas in this case, what I'd like to do is actually set the text mode state to be no. And if I was to update the select mode state to be yes, that means that our group is going to be displayed on our page, which would allow this user to immediately then update the size and color of that text, which is what I would like to work on next within our build. And so the first thing I want to build out is the feature that will allow us to update the color of some selected text. So if I select on my group text color preview here, you'll need to remember that I have a focus group attached to this. And what I'd like to do is create a way to not only store the value of a color that's selected within this color picker inside my group here, but I'd also like to create a way to modify the color of text that's been selected within our canvas here. And so in order to first of all store the value of a color within our group here, unlike our first group where we were storing a background color, I don't have a data field in my database that stores the value of a text color. And that's because when a user works on a canvas, there's only going to be one background color at a time. Therefore, we can store just one value in our database. But when it comes to adding text onto the canvas, there's no telling how much text a user is going to add. So unfortunately, creating one data field isn't going to be sufficient. And so what we can actually do is dynamically store the value of a text color code within our group here. And the way we can do that is by updating the type of content that's stored within our white group. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the type of content here to be a text type. And the reason I'm selecting it to be a text type is because I would like to store a color code within this group, which will register as a text field. And then what I'd like to do is update the color code that's stored in that group every single time the value of our color picker has changed. And so this is actually a very similar process to the workflow trigger we created when we updated our background color. So if we jump over into our workflow tab here, you might remember that we had built out the workflow that recognized when the color picker for our background was changed, and in which case we were updating the value stored in our database. Essentially, I'd like to replicate the same workflow, but instead of updating a value in our database, I'm going to update a value stored within our group. And because I'm going to be creating another workflow that falls under the same category of working with a color picker, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on our existing workflow here, and I'm just going to start by updating the event color of this to be blue. And then I'm going to create an additional workflow here. I'm going to head to my element triggers, and I'm going to select the option here that recognizes when the color picker value has been changed. And because we're creating yet another workflow that's triggered by a color picker, I'm going to start by updating the event color to be blue. And then I'll just need to determine which particular color picker will be triggering this workflow. And in this case, it's going to be our canvas color picker text color. And then within our workflow, we're just going to need to add a couple of different steps. And the first is that I would like to be able to modify the color of any text that's been selected within our canvas at that point in time. So let's say a user has added in a text element, then they've clicked on that text element and they want to update the color of it. Thankfully, there is a workflow action that allows us to recognize which text element has been clicked, and then we can modify the values of it. And so if we add a workflow step here, and just type in the word modify, you'll see the option to modify a selected element within our canvas. And within here, this is where you can choose to make any changes to the element that's been selected. And today we're going to particularly be focused on our text element values here. So you can see we can update the font style, the color of the text, as well as the value of it and the font size. And the value I would like to change here is of course going to be the font color. And instead of having it be this black color here, I'm going to want it to be the new color of the color picker that a user has just selected. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to select that the font color should now be this color picker, its value. And then while we're here, what I'd also like to do is update the font size for this particular text element. And in this case, I'd like this to be the value of the input field within our menu item here. And the reason why we're also updating the font within this workflow step is because let's say a user has taken the time to customize the font size. In this example, let's say they've updated the font size to be 60. If a user was to then update the color of that font, because we're modifying a selected element and the font size is set to 20, it would automatically revert that font to be 20 again. And so what I'm going to want to do is just have this be the value of the input where we're storing our text size. So I'm just going to search for our input text size, its value. And at this point in time, we will just need to make one change to that input field. So if I was to click away, you'll see that this won't be valid. And that's because our font size field here is going to need to register the value of a number. Whereas with our input field at this point in time, it's currently just registered as a text field. So if I update its content format to be an integer and then jump back into my workflow editor, we should see that that is now valid because we are storing the value of a number within it. But the other thing I'd like to point out is that we'll also need to update the value stored within our text field here. So every single time a user updates the color of some text, these settings are automatically going to be applied to the selected text field. And as you'll see here, the text value is currently set as a static entry that just displays the word edit me. And so at this point in time, if a user was to in fact update the color of their text, the value of this would automatically revert to this option. And that of course is not the experience we want to create. We want the text to maintain the same value that it had before a user has chosen to select it and update the color of it. And thankfully, this is pretty straightforward to maintain the text value. What we're going to do is we're going to remove this static value here. Then we're going to choose to insert dynamic data. And we're going to scroll on down and select from our canvas on the page. So in this case, mine's called Canvas Main A. And I'm just going to type in the word text here. And I'd like the text value to maintain the value of the selected text that a user has currently selected within our overall canvas. And once we've finished configuring these settings, what I'd like to do now is make sure that we are updating the color that's displayed within the group on our page that shows a preview of the selected text color. And so if you remember, on the smaller group within our header menu, we had updated the content type to store a text value. And I'd mentioned at that point in time we were going to be storing the value of a color code. Well, it's at this point that we can pass on the value of a color code that has of course been selected from our color picker. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add an additional step within our workflow here. We're going to scroll on down to our element actions. And underneath the group submenu here, you'll see the option to display data within a group. And that just allows us to temporarily store the value of some data within an element. And the element is of course going to be our group text color preview. And the data I would like to display is going to be this color picker, its value, which is going to be a written color code. And just like that, that is how we can update the overall color of any selected text within our canvas here. Once we've updated the color of the text within our actual canvas, what I'd also like to do is display that very same color within our group here, which of course is just going to show a preview of what the selected text color is. And now because we're storing the value of a text color code within our group, this allows us to pull and display the data that we had just sent through in our workflow. So underneath our color for this particular group, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the text data stored within this group. And so I'm going to scroll on down and choose to reference this group itself. So that is my group text color preview. And once I have selected this group, I'm going to choose to display its color text. And now that will automatically display the color of the selected text within our canvas. And now that is how we can update and display the color of text selected within our canvas here. And I'll be showing you a preview of how that functions in a moment. But the last thing I'll need to do is build out a way to update the actual size of the font for any text elements that are selected. And the way in which I'll be creating that feature is by leveraging a custom state. And the reason I'm doing that is because if I was to add a custom state onto my text group here, I could temporarily store the value of a number within that state. And that number would of course be our font size. And then let's say every single time a user either manually adds in a number in our input field or chooses to increase or decrease the number itself, I could update the value that's stored within our custom state for this group and have that be reflected upon our font that's been selected on our canvas. And I know this might sound a little bit confusing, but I'll be sure to explain it in as much detail as I can. But what we're going to do is first of all select on our overall blue group here in the background. So that is our group edit text. So that is the container group that all of our separate elements sit within here. And I'm going to want to create a custom state on this group. So I'm going to head to my information icon here. I'm going to add a new custom state. And I'm going to call this custom state font size. And as I mentioned, this state type is going to register the value of a number. I will create that. And what I'd like to do is just add in a default font size. I'm just going to leave this as 16 for now. I can then choose to close my custom state. And then if I was to select on my input field here, what I could do is display the number stored within our custom state within this input field here. So I'm going to select the initial content field. And I'd like to choose from our group edit text, so that is our overall blue group, its font size custom state. I would like to display its value, and because the font size is a number, and the content format of this input field is also a number, that's going to validate. But now what I want to do is create an experience that either increases or decreases the size of the font whenever one of these icons is clicked here. So I'm going to start with my increase button. So whenever our plus button is clicked, I'm going to start a new workflow here. And within this workflow, I'd like to do two things. the first thing I'm going to want to do is update the custom state stored in our group, in which case I'm going to want to increase the number that's stored by 1 increment. So let's say the default number is 16, so that's our font size. I'd like to increase that to now be 17. And so every single time a user clicks on our plus icon, it's going to add 1 more increment onto our custom state. And so I'm going to click on our workflow actions here. I'm going to type in the word state because I'd like to set the state of an element. The element I'll be setting the state of is our group edit text. The custom state is going to be our font size custom state. And for the value here, I'm just going to need to recognize what the current font size is. And then I'm going to need to plus an additional number onto that. And so I'm just going to recognize what the group edit text, its current font size is. And then I would like to plus to that 1. And so that way now if the font size is 16, it's going to update it to now be 17. And now the last thing I'd like to do within this workflow here is add an additional step that modifies an element that's selected again. So very similar to our color picker workflow that we've just created, I'd like to modify a selected element, and in which case I'd like to update its font size. But because I'm going to need to modify the selected element every single time our either plus icon is clicked, our minus icon is clicked, or the font size is manually changed, instead of creating the same workflow 4 times over, what I can create is what's called a custom workflow within Bubble. And that just allows me to create one separate workflow once. And then whenever I'd like that workflow to run, I can simply reference it within a separate workflow. And I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but as I build that out, it's going to make a lot more sense. So I'm going to start by creating a new workflow from scratch here. And I'm going to scroll on down and select to create a custom event. And I'll be calling the event name modify selected event. And for the color of this, I'm just going to update this to be orange because this will just help me differentiate between any other workflows in my workflow editor here. And within this workflow, I'm going to need to just add in one step, and that is that I would like to modify the value of the selected element. So I'm going to type in the word modify. I'll select the option to modify a selected element in our canvas. And when it comes to the values that I would like to edit, I'm going to want to update the font size here. So I'm going to select on this value. And of course, in this case, I'd like the font size to be the value that's stored within our custom state. And so I'm going to scroll on down to our group edit text once again, and I'll reference its font size custom state. And so because of course when we had created the workflow every single time our plus icon was selected, if you'll remember, the first thing we did was update the font size within our custom state. As it is now updating essentially the that would then reflect to be the value stored within our custom state. As it is now the only other thing I'd like to also change is going to be within our custom state. The only other things I would like to change is that I'm also going to need to update the font color stored for this text, as well as also maintain the value of the text itself, like I had explained before. And so when it comes to the font color, every single time a user updates the value of the text, I don't want the font color to reset. And so in order to maintain the same value that's stored within the group on our page that displays the color of some selected text, I'm just going to remove the static value here and choose to insert dynamic data. And I'd like to scroll on down to the group text color preview option, and I'd like to display its text value, which if you remember, that is where we're passing the data of our color picker through and storing the color code itself within that group. And so now it's just going to ensure that when a user updates the size of any text elements, it'll just maintain the same font color. And look, we'll need to do the same thing for our text value here. When a user updates the size of the text, I obviously don't want to reset the value of the text stored within that element itself. And so in order to maintain a consistent value, I'm going to insert dynamic data. I'm going to scroll on down to our canvas main here, which is just the canvas we're working with on our page. And then I'd like to type in the word text, and I'd like to maintain the value of the selected text for this canvas. And so now, once again, whenever a user updates the font size, it's going to ensure that the actual text itself consistently remains as the same value. And now that's everything I'd like to update within this workflow step here. As I previously mentioned though, I'm going to need to create a way to trigger this particular custom workflow every single time the value of the font size is updated for a selected text element. And in order to do that, I'm going to open up our previous workflow we built out that's triggered every single time our plus icon is clicked. And in this case, I'd like to add one additional step after we finish updating the custom state. And if I scroll on down to my custom events option, I'm going to choose to trigger a custom event. The custom event we'll trigger is our only one, which is our orange event here that we just created. And as you can see, it's as simple as that. I don't need to change anything else, because now at this point I have a workflow that I can easily reference to take care of the rest of the work itself. The only thing I would like to change is that on the trigger of our workflow here, so the workflow where our plus icon is selected, I'd like to update the event color to also be orange, so that way I can categorize between all of the different options here. And then I'd also like to create a workflow that's ran every single time our minus icon is selected. And it's going to behave the exact same as this workflow here. So it's going to update the custom state, and then it's going to trigger our custom workflow. And in order to streamline this whole process, I'm just going to choose to copy our existing workflow. I'm going to paste in another version. Only this time I'm going to select on the workflow trigger, and I'll update the element itself that triggers this workflow to be our minus square icon. And then when it comes to the first step of our workflow, instead of plussing a number to our custom state, I'm going to subtract a number from it. So now it will decrease the font size of our custom state. And then I won't need to make any changes to the second step of our workflow because it's going to trigger our custom event. The only other last thing I'd like to create within this workflow is just a way to reference when a user manually adds in a custom number into this input field. So let's say instead of having to continually click on the plus icon multiple times, if a user just wants to update the font size to 60, I'd like to allow them to just type that in. And so if I open up my workflow editor here, I'm going to need to create a brand new workflow from scratch. I'm going to head to my elements trigger here, and I'm going to recognize when the value of an input is changed. The input we'll be referencing is our input text size. And I'm going to update the event color here to be orange. And then within this workflow, I'm going to add in pretty much the exact same steps of our previous workflows. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is set the state of an element. The element will be our group edit text here. I'm going to update its font size state. And instead of identifying what the current state is and plussing or minusing a number to it, because a user is just manually putting in a text size that they would like, they're essentially overriding any value we have stored currently within that custom state. So I'm going to just want to set the value to be this input, its value, so whatever value a user types in. And then finally, I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to head to our custom events, and I'm just going to choose to trigger our custom event. And it is as simple as that. And that is everything we need to cover when it comes to having the ability to update the size and color of a text element. I personally think that that is probably one of the harder features to build out within our Canva clone product today. But what I'd like to do is just show you a quick preview of how this is now going to function within our bubble editor itself. Over in a preview of my application here, I'm going to add a text element onto my page. And of course what you'll see is that because we have updated the select mode to be enabled after a text element is added onto our page, the group to edit the values of our text field are now visible. And if I was to want to update the color of the text here, one thing I've noticed is that I'm being displayed this error message from the Fabric.JS plugin. And I do have a hunch as to why this error is being displayed. If I was to jump back into my bubble editor and open up our workflow tab, you might remember that we had created a workflow that's triggered each time the value of our color picker is updated, which of course then modifies the color of the text that we've selected on our canvas. And within this step of our workflow here, we had in fact updated the font color and the font size. But because we have no value stored within our text field here, it's causing that error message to be displayed. And in order to prevent that error message from being displayed, what we'll need to do is just update the value stored within this text field, which of course we'd like it to maintain the same value of the text that's already being typed into the selected option. And so I'm going to insert dynamic data into this field. I'm going to scroll on down and select from my canvas main on the page. And I'd like to just type in the word text. And I'd like this value here to be the value of the selected text that we're currently editing. And then if I was to jump back over into the preview of my application and refresh the page, what you'll now see is that if I was to add a text element onto our page here, I could update the value of this. And now when I select my group to open up my color picker, I can freely just choose to update the color itself of this text. If I'd like, I could also just update the font size here. So I could increase that by an increment, or I could just type in a flat number itself. And as you'll see, that text size will now be updated. From here though, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist, just because I'd like to tick off that we've finished building out the feature to not only edit the color of text selected within our canvas, but we've also created a feature that allows users to also edit the size of that selected text. And from here, we can move along to the next feature I'd like to cover within our build. And as you can see, we're actually getting quite close to the end of the finished product. The next feature I want to prioritize though is just creating the ability to copy and paste elements within our canvas. So let's say a user selects a text element or even an image they've uploaded and they just want to make a copy of that inside our canvas element. We're just going to add some additional buttons that will run workflows whenever they would like to make that selection. And thankfully this is a pretty straightforward process to add into our build. So we're going to jump back into our bubble editor here. And what I'd like to do is just add some additional buttons within my main header menu here. And the way in which I'll be doing that is adding some additional group elements with icons within them. And so I'm going to start by scrolling down in my element selection menu here. I'm going to head to my containers menu and I'm going to choose to add in a group element into my existing header group. And the first thing I'll be doing is updating the name of this to be called group copy. And then I'm going to remove the style of this group because I'd like to set the background style to be a flat color. And I'll also update the border to be a solid line. And then finally, I'll update the roundness of that border to be 10, just so that way the edges are curved. And then I'm going to jump over into my layout tab here. I will update the container layout to be a column. I will then vertically align this group within my existing header group. And when it comes to the dimensions of this button, I'm just going to want this to be the same size as our existing group element here, which if you remember was 40 pixels by 40 pixels. So for my width, I'm going to set this as 40 pixels and I'll keep that selected as a fixed width. For our height, I'm also going to select that I'd like that to be a fixed width, but I'll just need to update the pixel size to be 40. And what you'll now see is that it is the same size as our previous group that we've added onto our header menu here. When it comes to the margins of this button, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left, and that will just position it away from our existing group where we edit text. And one thing I should just note is that if you remember with our group edit text here, this element was not visible on our page by default. And because we had selected that we want to collapse this element's height when it's hidden, if at any point in time this group is not being displayed, this new group we've just added will move over and take its place. And because we've added 20 pixels of margin on this new group, it'll just ensure it doesn't touch our color selection group here as well. But within this group, I'd just like to add in an icon element. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements here. I will select to add in an icon, and I'm just going to search for a paperclip icon here. And I'd like to jump to our layout tab and update the size of this. I'd like it to be 20 pixels by 20 pixels. And I will horizontally align that in the center of the group it sits within. And then when it comes to the top margin, I'm just going to give it 10 pixels of margin, so that way it's positioned roughly in the center of our group there. And now, of course, this main group is going to act like a button. And so when it's clicked, I'm going to want to run a workflow. And so I'm going to jump over to my Appearance tab here. And I'm going to choose to start a new workflow every single time this button is clicked. And within this workflow, this is actually relatively straightforward. I'm just going to add a step here and type in the word copy. And then I'll see the option to copy selected items on the canvas that we have on our page. It's as simple as that. That's all we need to add. And then when it comes to the pasting option here, I'm just going to streamline the whole process by copying this group. I'll paste in another version of it. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called group paste. For the icon within this group, I'm just going to search for a clipboard icon. So I'll type in the word clip and just choose the very first option here. And now when this group is clicked, I'm going to want to paste any elements on our canvas. So I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow here. And whenever this button is clicked, I'm just going to search for the word paste. I'll see the option to paste elements onto my canvas. And creating a copy and paste feature is as simple as that. If I was to jump over into the preview of my application here and I just refresh the page, what I could do is insert an image from my media library. And then if I was to open my select mode, I could click on this image itself and I could choose to make a copy of this and then I could paste in a new version there. You'll see it's as simple as that. If we'd really like, what we could even do is also add in an alert message that displays when someone copies an element, just to notify them that it has actually been successfully copied. So if we just jump back into our bubble editor, what I'd like to do is scroll on down to our visual elements, and I'd just like to select to add an alert onto our page anywhere, just because I'd like to select the option to position this alert at the top of my page. And I'd like to update the text within this alert to display the words copied to clipboard. And then when it comes to the layout of this alert, I'm going to unselect that it should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0 and the maximum width as infinite. And now if you're not familiar with alert messages, they allow you to temporarily display an alert on your page. And the way to display them is by using a workflow action. So if I select on my copy button here and open up my workflow where I had copied an element, within this workflow I could add an additional step and I could display my alert message. So I'm going to scroll on down to my element actions here and you'll see the option for the alert category. I'd like to show an alert message, and by default I only have one alert message on my page, so it's going to show that. If I then jump back into the preview of my application and refresh the page, I could once again add an image onto my canvas, use the select mode within my cursor, choose to copy this image, and that alert will now be displayed. And then just like before, I could paste another version of it onto my canvas. From here though, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the feature to both copy and paste elements within our canvas. And you can see that the next feature that I want to cover is the ability to flip elements horizontally and vertically. So let's say if you've got an image that you want to flip in a different direction, this is definitely a feature we can create within the Fabric.JS plugin. And thankfully it's a relatively straightforward process. So we're going to jump back into our bubble editor, open up our design tab, and I'm just going to choose to hide my alert on my page for the time being. And when it comes to building out the feature to flip elements horizontally and vertically, it's very much the same as what we had just covered with our copy and paste workflows. What we'll need to do is essentially just add in 2 additional buttons and then create 2 simple workflows. And so to streamline that process, I'm just going to select my paste button here. I'm going to make a copy of that. And I'll just update the name of this group to be called group flip horizontal. And then I'm going to select the icon within this. I will open up our icon library and I'll search for arrow icons. And I can see there's an option here that looks like it has 2 different arrows pointing in a horizontal direction. So I'm going to update it to be this. And then every single time this group is clicked, I'm going to start a workflow. And this workflow is incredibly simple to build out. We're just going to add a step here, type in the word flip, and you'll see both options to either flip a selected element horizontally, or you could flip it vertically. In this case, I'm going to want to select to flip the element horizontally, and then I'm going to jump back into my design tab. I'm going to make a copy of this button here. I will update the name of it to be called flip vertical. I'll then need to update the icon that sits within it. I'll once again need to search for arrow icons, only this time I'll select the option that is the vertical arrow. And then finally, I will click on the overall group itself, and I'll start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'll type in the word flip, and we'll select the option to vertically flip a selected element within our canvas. It's as simple as that. If I jump over into the preview of my canvas and refresh the page, I could now add an image onto my canvas, open up my select mode cursor state, and if I'd like, I could either flip this element horizontally, or I could even flip it vertically. It's as simple as that. And so from here, we're going to jump back into my Notion checklist once again, and we're going to tick off that we've now built out the feature to flip elements both horizontally and vertically. And then from here, there is two last features I'd like to add into our build, and these actually go hand in hand together, and that's the ability to save the contents within our canvas. So essentially the ability to save a project, so that way when a user opens it at a later point in time, they'll be able to pick up where they left off from. And then finally, on top of that, I'd like to explain how we could download the canvas image as a PNG file. And so what we're going to do is jump over into our bubble editor here. And the first thing I'd like to do is add a button element onto our initial header menu here. And in order to streamline the process, I'm going to select our group flip vertical here. I'm going to make a copy of it. Only this time I'm going to add some text into this button instead of just displaying an icon. But before I update the icon within it, I'm just going to want to update the name of this group. I'm going to be calling this group share settings. And when it comes to the layout of this group, I'm going to open up our layout tab here, and I'm going to head on down to our width, and I'm going to update this to be 100 pixels in width. But I'll keep the height at 40 pixels, so that way it remains the same height as every other group button we've added into our header menu. And then when it comes to the content we'll be displaying within this group, I'm going to select my icon element here and delete that. I'm then going to scroll on up and add a text element into this group. And I'd like to display the word share within this. But before I do that, what I would like to do is actually add in an icon element. And I'd just like to point out that it is possible to actually add in icon elements through a text element. It just requires a little bit of HTML formatting, and I'd be more than happy to explain how you can add that. So I'm going to start by inputting a open square bracket, followed by the letters FA. That is the HTML structure for an icon. I'm going to then close my square bracket. And then next to this, I'm going to need to paste in the name of the icon I would like. The name of that is going to be share square O. And the way in which you can find that is you can search through your icon library and just identify what the name of that specific icon is. And this icon that I'm going to be using just looks like a share button. And then so from here, I'm going to close off my HTML formatting. So I'm going to add another open square bracket, followed by a /. I'll then follow that with the letters FA and then a close square bracket. And what you'll see is that now that will be formatted as an icon. Beside this, I'm just going to add in a space followed by the word share. And then if I wanted, I could remove the style of this element, and I could just update the font size to be 18, so it's a little bit larger. And if I'd like, I could also center align the text within the actual text element itself. And then of course I'll need to update the layout settings for this. So I'm going to head to my layout tab and update the horizontal alignment to be positioned in the center of the group it sits within. I'll also unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now it'll take up the adequate amount of space within our group. And then finally I'll set the minimum height to 0, because we've selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then the last thing I'd like to do is just add in 5 pixels of margin at the top of this element, And what you'll see is that that now looks like it is positioned in the center of our overall group. And so when this group is actually clicked, what I'd like to do is display yet another focus group that's going to almost toggle like an extended menu, in which a user will see the ability to either save their project or download their project as a PDF. And so of course, in order to create that extended menu experience, I'm going to need to add in yet another focus group. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I will add in a group focus element anywhere on my page. I'm going to update the name of this to be called group focus share menu. And then I'll jump over to my appearance tab here and set the reference element. I'm going to type in the word share, and it will be my group share settings, which is now anchored to our button that we've created. And then within this group, what I'd like to do is display two text elements on top of each other. So I'm going to need to jump to my layout menu here, and I'll update the container layout of our focus group to be a column, just because I'll be stacking these elements on top of each other. We'll come back in a moment and update the height and width. But for now, what I'd like to do is just scroll on up and add in a text element inside this particular group. And when it comes to the text within this menu, I'd like to once again display an icon followed by some text. So I'm going to add in an open square bracket followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And then the first option I'd like to add within our menu here is the ability to save a project. And the icon I would like to use is called the save icon. So I'm just going to type in the word save. Then I'll add yet another open square bracket followed by a /, the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. And what you'll see is that that is now formatted as a save icon. I'll then type in the word save next to that. And then if I really wanted, I could remove the style of this. I could update the font size to be 18, just so it's a little bit bigger. I'll then jump into my layout tab here. I will unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then I will also set the minimum height to be 0, just because the option to fit the height to the content within it has been selected. And then finally, I'll just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the left, so that way it's not touching the borders of our actual group itself. And then from here, I'm just going to make a copy of this text. Only this time, I'd like to update the text that's displayed to display the word download, as well as update the icon that's displayed. And in order to streamline the process of creating the icon, I'm just going to remove the name of the icon here. I'm just going to type in the word download. And what you'll see is that will automatically update that to be a download icon. And then I can do the same for our text that's displayed next to it. So I'm going to update that text to display the word download. And the only other thing I'd like to do is just head to my layout tab, and I just want to add 10 pixels of margin to the bottom of this particular element, just because I'd now like to select on my focus group and set the minimum height to be 0. And of course, it also has the option selected here to fit the height of the element to the content within it. So it's going to fit nicely around our options there. And then when it comes to the width, I'm just going to leave this as fixed width, but I'm just going to update this to be 150 pixels. If you'd really want, you could make that a little bit smaller because you can see there's a bit of empty space, but I'm happy with just leaving it at that. And now from here, before we actually build out the workflows to save and download a project, we're obviously going to need to create a way to display our extended menu here. So I'm going to click on our overall group here, which is our group share settings. And I'm going to create a workflow every single time it is clicked. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word toggle. I will choose to toggle an element. I'm going to search for our focus group element. And the element I'll be toggling is our group focus share menu. It's as simple as that. I'll then jump back into my design tab. And as I mentioned, whenever you refresh a page, your focus group will move back to the top left-hand corner of your page. What I might do is just reposition this next to my share menu for the time being, just so that way it's easier to follow. But what I'd like to do now though is select my text here that displays the word save, because I'd like to create a workflow every single time this is clicked. So I'm going to choose to open up my workflow editor here when this text is clicked. And then within this workflow, I'm going to need to add just a couple of steps. And the first is that I'd like to save the serialization of the current canvas we're working on. And if you remember, the serialization, as I explained when we were creating our database, is essentially just going to store a long string of text that just identifies the position of all of the elements that we've added onto our canvas. So let's say if you've got an image and then some text, it's just going to classify what the image is, where it should be positioned on our canvas, and the same with our text. And so I'm going to type in the word serialization here, and I'd like to choose the option to save the serialization of a canvas, and it's automatically going to save the serialization of the one canvas on our page. And then from here, what I'd also like to do is create a way to generate a PNG file of this particular canvas with all of the content on it. And so that way, when a user then chooses to download the canvas, we have that PNG file ready that they can quickly just download at an instance. And so I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to type in the word PNG, and I'm going to choose to save the PNG to our URL, which, as I said, just creates almost like a preview of the PNG that's ready to go once a user selects to download it. And when we add this step into our workflow, we're just going to need to configure a few fields that will just determine what the height and width of the PNG are when they actually are downloaded. And of course, for the height and width, we have already predetermined these when a user created their project. So for the height, I would like this to be the current page project, its height. And then for the width, this will be the current page project, its width. And then finally, we can also customize the file name when that PNG is downloaded. And this, of course, could be the name of the project itself. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current page project, its name. And now that is how we can make changes to the actual project that we're working on within our canvas. But what we'll also need to do is make sure that these changes are reflected within our database. So of course, as you can see, we've saved the serialization here within our canvas, but we're going to need a way to save that within our database as well. So that way, every single time a user loads a project, we can easily reference which serialization number to load for a particular project. And so what we're going to need to do is create another workflow. But before I build that out, what I'd like to do is actually click on my workflow trigger here, and I'd like to update the event color to be purple, just so that way I can categorize any of my save and download workflows as one particular color type. Because I'm now going to create a brand new workflow from scratch here, I'm going to head to my elements option, and I'll be selecting the choice here that references when a canvas has generated a saved image. I would like this workflow to run. And so if you remember in our previous workflow that we've just built, the very last step generates a PNG image to our URL. And so once this workflow has finished running, this new workflow will pick up and it'll allow us to make some additional changes to our project. And so for the time being, I'm just going to move my head out of the way there. And within this workflow, I'm just going to add an action. I'll head to our data tab, and I'd like to choose to make changes to a thing. The thing I would like to change is our current page project. And then there's two things I'd like to update within this project. The first, as I mentioned before, is going to be the serialization. So although we've generated that serialization code on our canvas itself, I'd like to now store that within our database. And so I'm going to select that the serialization should equal this main canvas's serialized canvas. So that is the serialization code we generated in our very first workflow. And then the other field I'd like to change is just going to be the preview image. So this is like the thumbnail for the actual project. I'd like this to equal the value of this canvas's PNG URL, which is the PNG we had saved to our canvas's URL. And that will now store that as an actual image file within our database. And then the very last step I'd like to add to this workflow is that I want to display a success message to the user, just letting them know that their project has successfully saved in our database. And in order to do that, I'm just going to need to add yet another alert message onto my page. So I'm going to jump over to our design tab here, and I'm going to add an alert message on my page. And when it comes to this alert, I'm just going to have this display the words project saved. And I would once again like to position this alert at the top of my page. And I'd also like it to extend across the full width of my page. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. I'll unselect that this should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now that will scale across my page. And then if I was to jump over into my workflow editor once again, open up my workflow we were just working on, I'm going to add an additional step. And if I just move my head out of the way again, I'm going to just type in the word alert because I'd like to show an alert message. And now I'd like to select the project saved alert. And that will complete the workflow of saving an entire project. While we're working on this workflow, I'm going to click on the trigger here, and I'm also going to update the event color to now be purple, so that way I can easily tell which of my workflows involve saving a project. And now that we do understand how we can actually save a project, one thing I'd like to point out is that we'll also need to understand how we can load a saved project. So let's say a user opens up this project page, and they want to pick up where they've left off within their design. What we can do is, because we now have that serialization for this project saved in our database, we can actually load that serialization onto our canvas. And the way we can do that is by editing the workflow that was triggered every single time the page is loaded. Before we do that, I'm just going to move my head back over to the left-hand side. I will then open up this workflow here. And if you remember, in this workflow, we had taken the time to set the dimensions of the canvas. Whereas what I'd like to do is add an additional step here. And I'm just going to type in the word serialization. And in this case, I'd like to now load a serialization. And when it comes to the serialization I'd like to load, this of course is saved in our database. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current page project, its serialization. And that's all we'll need to do. And because of course we are loading a serialization, I'd also just like to click on the event trigger here and update the color of this workflow to be purple, just so I know it has something to do with either loading or saving a project. And now at this point, we're almost finished everything I wanted to cover. The very last feature I would like to cover is how we can actually now download a project as a PNG file. And so I'm just going to select my focus group here, and I'm going to click on the download text. And this is a very straightforward workflow to build out. So I'm just going to choose to start a workflow every single time a user clicks the download text. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word download, and I'll be selecting this option here to just download a canvas. And now it's going to download that PNG file we had saved in our URL. And the only thing we'll need to update is the name of this file. I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'll have this be the current page project, its name. And that's all we'll need to add within this workflow. And so because this involves saving or downloading something, I'm going to click on the workflow trigger, and I'll also update the event color to be purple. And now that is everything I wanted to cover within this particular step of our tutorial. Let's jump over into our application now and take a preview of what it looks like to both save and download a project within our Canva clone. Over in the preview of my application, I've just created a new project here, and I've added some elements onto my canvas. And if I would like, I could open up my share menu here, and it's going to toggle my focus group. And in which case, I'd like to start by saving my actual canvas. So when I click that, the workflow is going to run, and as you can see, my alert message was just displayed. And now one thing I'd like to point out is that if I was to refresh this page here, what you'll now see is that because we have saved the serialization of this canvas and we've loaded it every single time the page was loaded, it has stored all of my elements in their exact correct position that we had left off from. And finally, if I would like to download this project, I can select my share menu once again, and I can select to download this as a PNG file. And what you'll see is that it will automatically generate a PNG and save it to the downloads on my local device. So now you could save or share this image wherever you would like. Back in my Notion checklist, I'm just going to tick off that we've finished building out the last of the core features within our Canva clone build today. And that of course was not only the ability to save a project, but also how we could load a saved project from our database, and finally how we could download a project as a PNG file. The very last thing I just wanted to point out though within this tutorial is just a list of additional features I'd recommend taking a look at if you wanted to take your Canva clone to the next level. And the very first feature that I would suggest looking at building is just being able to create multiple pages within a project. And this is actually something I recently covered within a tutorial where I built a Google Slides clone. So within that tutorial, I'd also used the Fabric.JS plugin, and I explained how you could just add a repeating group onto a project page, which just displays a whole series of different canvases. So that way a user can add different slides or pages into a particular project. So if that's something you're interested in, I definitely recommend checking that out. And then finally, the only other thing I'd mention is just taking a look at how you could update and edit these styles of different colors, shapes, and drawings on your canvas. And this is something that I did briefly cover throughout this tutorial today. But let's say if you wanted to be able to customize the shapes that were added onto your project. So instead of adding a square by default, you could add things like a triangle or a circle, or even update the colors of those shapes. That's definitely possible with the Fabric.JS plugin. And if you find yourself wanting to add some of those additional customization features, I definitely recommend checking out the Fabric.JS documentation. So as I mentioned, on the plugin page itself, it not only has a link to a demo editor that you can see in real time how it's built and how it functions, but they also have a link to a whole suite of rich documentation, which just explains how you can get the most out of the plugin. So it will cover how to update the different shapes, as well as the different colors and sizes of elements you add onto your canvas. But at this point, I'm pretty happy with the product that we built today. I know this tutorial was a little bit long, but I hope this gives you a good insight into how you can create your own Canva clone within Bubble. And I hope that some of these core features help you throughout the rest of your builds for any other projects that you're creating. And just like that, we've finished the build for our Canva MVP today. As you can see, it's never been easier to bring your application to life using a combination of both Bubble and the Fabric.JS plugin. As I'd mentioned, if you're interested in building out some of the additional features that I covered, or would like any additional guidance when using the Fabric.JS plugin, I'd recommend checking out both the documentation page and the demo editor provided by Techblocks. These are really helpful resources that I'd personally used when I was first onboarding myself with the plugin, so I can't recommend them enough. In the meantime, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this course. And if you'd like to keep up to date with any additional Bubble resources that I share, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you're the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. As for now, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.